Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and drift across the ancient Mediterranean, where purple-sailed ships once ruled the waves, and a city greater than Athens commanded an empire that stretched from Sicily to the Atlantic. This is Carthage, a name you may have heard whispered in tales of Rome's greatest enemy, but a civilization you were never truly allowed to know. Here, in this space between past and present, we journey to the shores of North Africa, to walk among merchant princes who counted their wealth in mountains of silver and trade routes that spanned 3 continents. We stand in harbours where hundreds of warships rested in circular docks, so ingenious that Roman engineers would later copy them. We imagine the navigators who mapped coastlines beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sailing into Atlantic waters centuries before Rome ever dreamed of empire. We picture the artisans dyeing cloth in that legendary purple extracted from thousands of sea snails, the astronomers charting stars to guide ships safely home, the families living in towering apartment buildings that rivaled anything in Rome. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about Hannibal's elephants or the wars that destroyed everything. It's about the lives lived, the merchant negotiating prices in 5 languages, the ship captain reading the stars, the mother teaching her daughter the old Phoenician songs that connected them to Tyre and Sidon. It's about a civilization that was systematically erased, its libraries burned, its stories rewritten by the victors who feared its memory. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through forgotten worlds, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There was a city once that controlled more wealth than Athens, commanded more ships than any fleet the Greeks could muster, and came within a single battle of erasing Rome from history before Rome ever became an empire. Its merchants traded with tribes in Britain for tin, sailed down the coast of Africa further than any European would venture for another 1,000 years, and built harbours so sophisticated that modern engineers still study their design. For 6 centuries, this city stood as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, its purple-dyed sails visible from Spain to Libya. And yet, if you ask most people today what they know about Carthage, you'll likely be met with silence, or perhaps a vague memory of Hannibal and his elephants. That's all that remains in popular memory of a civilization that once rivaled Rome itself. A culture so thoroughly destroyed that for nearly 2,000 years, everything we knew about them came from the writings of their enemies. The Romans told the story, and victors rarely tell the truth about those they've defeated. But the earth remembers what empires try to forget. Beneath the soil of modern Tunisia, the ruins of Carthage have slowly revealed themselves, and what they reveal is astonishing. A maritime empire built on trade rather than conquest, a republic that predated Rome's, a society of remarkable sophistication that the Romans both feared and secretly admired. They were Phoenicians originally, colonists from the ancient cities of Tyre and Sidon in what we now call Lebanon, sailing west in search of metals and trade routes sometime around the 9th or 8th century before Christ. Legend says a Phoenician princess named Elissa, fleeing her brother's murderous ambitions, founded the city in 814 BC. The locals called her Dido. But behind the legends was something real, a settlement that grew into a city, and a city that grew into an empire. At its height, Carthage wasn't just powerful, it was indispensable. If you wanted Spanish silver, African ivory, British tin, or Baltic amber, you traded with Carthage. The city's famous circular harbours could house over 200 warships, protected by walls 70 feet high and fortifications so massive their foundations are still visible today. The Carthaginians didn't conquer through ideology or divine mandate like the Romans would later claim. They conquered through commerce, contracts, and when necessary, calculated violence. But here's what makes Carthage so haunting. This was a civilization that came desperately close to changing the course of Western history, and then was methodically, deliberately erased. Not just defeated, erased. The Romans didn't simply conquer Carthage, they obliterated it, burned it for 17 days, sold its surviving population into slavery, and according to legend, ploughed salt into the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Then they wrote the history books, and in those books, the Carthaginians became the villains, the barbarians, the monsters who deserved their fate. For centuries that was all we knew. Roman accounts, Roman perspectives, Roman justifications, the Carthaginian libraries, their histories, their poetry, their records of exploration, all of it turned to ash in 146 BC. An entire literary tradition gone, a language nearly forgotten, a people scattered across the Mediterranean as slaves. But archaeology is a kind of resurrection. In the 19th century, excavators began uncovering the site of ancient Carthage, and what they found contradicted nearly everything the Romans had written. They found evidence of a sophisticated urban culture, of engineering prowess, of art and architecture that created something uniquely Carthaginian. They found the harbours, the walls, the homes with elaborate mosaics and indoor plumbing. They found proof of a civilization that didn't deserve to be forgotten, and so tonight we remember. Not the Carthage of Roman propaganda, but the real city, the purple city on the African coast, the maritime empire that nearly broke Rome before Rome broke the world. This is the story Rome tried to bury. This is Carthage, before the fall. Picture the North African coast in the 3rd century before Christ, where the Mediterranean stretches blue and endless towards Sicily, and the summer sun turns the limestone cliffs to gold. Here, on a peninsula jutting into the sea near what we now call Tunis, stood Carthage, its white-walled buildings rising in tiers from the harbours to the hill of Byrsa, where the great temple of Eshmun overlooked the city like a guardian watching his children. From a distance, approaching by ship, you would have seen the purple banners first, dyed with the rare murex shells that made Phoenician purple the most expensive colour in the ancient world, worth more than gold by weight. The city itself was vast by ancient standards, home to perhaps 400,000 people at its peak, larger than Athens, larger than any city in Italy. Its walls ran for 23 miles around the peninsula, thick enough that war elephants could pass along the top, studded with towers and gates that opened onto roads leading to Carthaginian territories across North Africa. But it was the harbours that truly defined Carthage, 2 circular basins connected by a narrow channel, one for merchant vessels and one for the navy. The military harbour could be sealed off by chains, its ships protected inside a circular island where the admiral's headquarters rose like a fortress, surrounded by covered docks that could shelter 220 warships from both weather and enemy eyes. The Carthaginians were traders first, warriors second. While Greek cities built their wealth on farming and Rome built hers on conquest, Carthage built hers on knowing where things were and how to move them. They knew the wind patterns of the Atlantic, the river mouths of Africa, the tribal territories of Iberia. They established colonies and trading posts from Malta to Morocco, from Sardinia to the Pillars of Hercules, that narrow strait where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, and ancient sailors believed the world ended. Some Carthaginian explorers went even further. A navigator named Hanno, sometime in the 5th century BC, sailed down the west coast of Africa with 60 ships and 30,000 colonists, establishing settlements and trading posts until he reached what might have been modern Sierra Leone or beyond. The city's wealth was staggering. Merchants returned from Iberia with silver from the mines of Rio Tinto, copper from Cyprus, tin from the mysterious Cassiterides, the tin islands that might have been Cornwall or Brittany. The Carthaginians kept such secrets close. African trade brought ivory and gold from kingdoms beyond the Sahara, lions and elephants for arenas and armies, exotic woods and spices. From the western Mediterranean came grain, wine, olive oil, ceramics. The Carthaginian market, the great central forum, must have been a wonder of languages and goods. Numidian horsemen bargaining beside Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests examining Spanish metalwork, Iberian miners trading stories with sailors who'd seen the edge of the world. But Carthage was more than a marketplace. It was a republic, governed not by kings but by an elected council of elders and 2 chief magistrates called suffets, a system that predated Rome's consuls by perhaps a century. The Carthaginian constitution was famous throughout the ancient world. Aristotle studied it and praised its stability. Power was balanced between the aristocratic families who controlled the trade networks, the merchant classes who generated the wealth, and the popular assembly that could override the council in times of crisis. It wasn't democracy as Athens understood it, but it was remarkably stable, surviving for centuries without the civil wars and tyrannies that plagued Greek cities. The Carthaginians worshipped gods inherited from their Phoenician ancestors, Baal Hammon and his consort Tanit, deities of sky and fertility, whose symbols, the crescent moon and outstretched hands, appeared on everything from coins to tomb markers. Their temples were magnificent, built in the Phoenician style with Egyptian and Greek influences, decorated with ivory and gold and the famous Tyrian purple. Religious life was central, formal, and according to Roman accounts, occasionally horrific. The Romans claimed the Carthaginians sacrificed children to their gods, burning infants in the bronze arms of Baal's statue while drums drowned out their screams. Whether this was true, exaggerated, or complete Roman fabrication remains one of archaeology's most controversial questions, one we'll return to later. What's certain is that Carthaginian society was cosmopolitan, in ways Rome never was. The city absorbed influences from everywhere: Egyptian architecture, Greek philosophy, Numidian cavalry tactics, Iberian metallurgy. Its armies were multinational, composed of Libyan spearmen, Numidian horsemen, Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, even Gallic mercenaries when needed. The Carthaginians themselves rarely fought, preferring to hire professionals and focus on what they did best: sailing, trading, and managing the vast commercial empire that made it all possible. This would later become a weakness. Armies of mercenaries are loyal to pay, not patriotism, but for centuries it worked brilliantly. Life in Carthage was comfortable for those with wealth. The aristocratic families lived in spacious homes with courtyards and fountains, decorated with mosaics showing scenes of daily life, fishing, harvesting, religious ceremonies. They ate well: Mediterranean diet of bread and olive oil, fish from the harbours, fruits from the African interior, wine from their Sicilian and Sardinian colonies. The lower classes worked the docks, the markets, the workshops where pottery and metalwork and textiles were produced for export. Slaves, captured in wars or purchased from traders, did the hardest labour, though Carthaginian slavery appears to have been less brutal than what Rome would later practice. The Carthaginians had their own alphabet, descended from Phoenician script, and their own literature, histories and poetry, and religious texts that we know existed because Roman authors mentioned them, all lost now. We have fragments, inscriptions on tombs and temple walls, desperate letters scratched onto lead tablets and thrown into wells as offerings to the gods, but nothing more. The great library of Carthage burned when the Romans came. 28 volumes on agriculture survived, translated into Latin because they were useful. Everything else, the histories, the exploration accounts, the poetry, the philosophy, turned to ash. But before that ending there was this: 3 centuries of prosperity, of purple sails crossing blue water, of merchant ships heavy with treasure, of a city that believed itself eternal. The Carthaginians in the 3rd century BC had no reason to fear Rome. They'd signed treaties with the growing Italian city, dividing the Mediterranean into spheres of influence. They'd traded with Rome, even allied with her against the Greek colonies. Rome was a land power, Carthage ruled the sea. There seemed no reason for conflict. They were wrong. And in that miscalculation, in that failure to see how desperately Rome wanted what Carthage had, the doom of the Purple City was already written. For nearly 2,000 years after Rome burned Carthage to the ground, the city existed only in fragments, in Roman writings, in Greek accounts, in the dark legends that survivors carried with them into exile. The site itself became farmland, then a Roman colony rebuilt by Julius Caesar and Augustus, then a Byzantine stronghold, then an Islamic city, layer upon layer of new settlements burying the old. The Phoenician city, the real Carthage, the one that had challenged Rome, disappeared beneath the earth like a story too dangerous to remember. And then, in the 19th century, Europeans became obsessed with antiquity. It was the age of archaeology as adventure, when British lords excavated Greek temples and French scholars decoded Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the Ottoman Empire reluctantly allowed foreigners to dig up the ancient Near East. Tunisia, newly under French control, drew archaeologists like moths to flame. They came looking for Roman Carthage, the colonial city that had thrived for centuries after the destruction. What they found, buried deeper, older, stranger, was something Rome had tried very hard to erase. The first serious excavations began in 1862, when a French diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Charles-Ernest Boulay started exploring the hills above the ancient harbours. He wasn't looking for Phoenician Carthage, not specifically. He was mapping Roman ruins, tracing the layout of temples and forums that had served Rome's African province. But as his workers dug deeper, they began finding older walls, different styles of pottery, inscriptions in an alphabet that wasn't Latin or Greek. Boulay realised, with growing excitement, that he'd found the bottom layer, the first city, the one the Romans had supposedly obliterated so thoroughly that nothing remained. Other archaeologists followed. In the 1870s and 80s, teams from France, Britain and Germany descended on the site, competing for funding and fame, sometimes destroying as much as they uncovered in their haste. It was crude archaeology by modern standards, more treasure hunting than science, but it revealed the scale of what had been lost. They found the harbours, the circular basins that Appian, the Roman historian, had described in such detail that scholars thought he must be exaggerating. He wasn't. The harbours were exactly as he'd written, military and commercial, connected by a channel, the military one with its central island still visible beneath the silt and sand of centuries. They found the walls, massive fortifications that had ringed the city, walls so thick that their foundations extended 30 feet down into bedrock. Sections still stood, buried under later Roman construction, testament to engineering that had taken 60 years to build and 17 days to destroy. The walls had been triple-layered in places, with barracks built into them capable of housing 20,000 soldiers and 4,000 horses, and stables for 300 elephants. This wasn't the small trading post of Roman propaganda. This was a superpower's capital. But it was the Tophet that caused the greatest controversy, the sacred precinct dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon, where the Carthaginians had brought their most precious offerings. French archaeologists excavating in 1878 found layer upon layer of burial urns, thousands of them, containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, some with animal bones mixed in, others with just human remains. The urns were marked with symbols, crescents and hands, the signs of Tanit. Nearby stood stone markers inscribed with dedications, thanking the gods for hearing prayers, for granting favours, for accepting the offerings. The Romans had claimed the Carthaginians sacrificed children. Roman authors, Plutarch and Diodorus Siculus, wrote horrific descriptions of babies being placed in the heated bronze arms of Baal's statue, rolling down into flames while priests beat drums to drown the screaming. Every ancient enemy of Carthage repeated these accusations. The Greeks said it, the Romans said it, later Christian writers said it as proof of pagan barbarity. But were the Romans simply describing their own propaganda? Was this like every empire's justification for destroying its enemies, the claim that they were monsters who deserved it? The Tophet seemed to offer proof, but proof of what? Modern archaeologists have debated for over a century. Some argue the urns contain sacrificial victims, evidence that the Roman accounts, however exaggerated, contain truth. Others point to evidence that many urns hold stillborn infants or children who died of natural causes, suggesting the Tophet was a cemetery for babies who died before they could be buried in adult graveyards, a sacred space where grieving parents could ensure their children reached the gods. The debate continues, complicated by politics and emotion and the uncomfortable fact that our primary sources were Carthage's enemies. What's undeniable is that the Tophet existed, that thousands of infant remains were buried there with honour and ritual care, that this was central to Carthaginian religious life in ways we still don't fully understand. And what's also undeniable is that the Romans used these practices, real or exaggerated, to justify what they did to Carthage in 146 BC, to convince themselves and history that the Purple City deserved to burn. The excavations continued into the 20th century, becoming more scientific, more careful. Teams mapped the street grid, finding homes with indoor plumbing and drainage systems, workshops where purple dye was extracted from murex shells, the rotting piles still visible 2,000 years later. They found the massive temple complex on Bursa Hill, deliberately destroyed by the Romans, its foundation stones scattered like the Romans wanted to erase even the memory of Carthaginian gods. They found warehouses full of amphorae still bearing stamps identifying their contents. Wine from Sicily, oil from Iberia, grain from Sardinia, the fossilized records of a trading empire. In 1949, a British archaeologist named Donald Harden published a comprehensive study synthesizing decades of excavation, arguing that Carthage had been a sophisticated cosmopolitan society comparable to any in the ancient Mediterranean. The old Roman image of barbarian child killers became harder to maintain when you stood among the ruins of their libraries, their courts, their carefully engineered harbours. Other scholars followed, French, American, Tunisian, each adding pieces to the puzzle, each burial urn and broken column and painted pottery shard bringing the vanished city back from silence. Modern excavations use radar and satellite imaging, finding buried structures without disturbing them, mapping entire neighbourhoods that still lie beneath modern Tunis. What emerges is a picture of a great city destroyed at its height, not a declining power or a barbarous backwater, but a thriving metropolis with a functioning government, a powerful fleet, and a commercial empire that spanned the known world. The Romans didn't destroy Carthage because it was weak or wicked. They destroyed it because it was strong, because it was a rival, because as long as Carthage stood, Rome could never truly dominate the Mediterranean. The earth remembers. Beneath Tunisian suburbs and tourist hotels, beneath Roman columns and Islamic walls, the purple city sleeps. But archaeology, patient and persistent, has begun to wake it, piece by fragile piece. When the first archaeologists returned from Carthage with their findings, with photographs of massive harbour works and city walls and sophisticated urban planning, the academic world didn't quite know what to do with it. For nearly 2 millennia, the story of Carthage had been simple, comfortable even. They were the villains of Roman history, the treacherous merchants who sacrificed children and broke treaties, and sent Hannibal with his elephants to terrorise Italy. Rome had defeated them, civilised North Africa, and the world was better for it. That was the narrative taught in every European school, repeated in every classical history text, assumed by every scholar who read Livy or Polybius or Cicero. But now there was evidence suggesting something else entirely. The Carthaginians hadn't been barbarians living in squalor. They'd been sophisticated urban planners with engineering capabilities that matched or exceeded Rome's. Their harbours were more advanced than anything Rome built until the imperial period. Their fortifications were massive, their trade networks extensive, their government stable enough to last 6 centuries. This didn't fit the story. This didn't match what the Romans had written. The first response from many classicists was scepticism, sometimes bordering on hostility. These were men who'd spent their careers studying Roman texts, who'd built their reputations on understanding the Roman worldview, who taught generations of students that Rome represented civilization triumphing over barbarism. The idea that Rome might have been the aggressor, that Carthage might have been the victim, that the Punic Wars might have been about Roman expansionism rather than Carthaginian treachery, this was uncomfortable. It questioned foundational assumptions about Western civilization's origins. Some scholars argued the ruins were actually Roman, that Burlet and his colleagues had simply misdated the layers, that the sophisticated engineering must have come after the conquest when Rome rebuilt the city. Never mind that the architectural styles were completely different, that the inscriptions were in Punic rather than Latin, that the harbour designs matched ancient descriptions of Phoenician rather than Roman techniques. The cognitive dissonance was too great. If Carthage had been this advanced, this civilized, then what Rome did to it looked less like righteous conquest and more like calculated genocide. Others took a different approach, accepting the archaeological evidence but maintaining that the Carthaginians were still morally inferior. Yes, they'd been skilled engineers and successful merchants, but they were also child sacrificers, mercenary employers, profit-obsessed materialists without the civic virtue that made Rome great. The Tophet became central to this argument, proof that beneath the sophisticated facade was a barbarous culture that deserved its fate. Never mind that Romans exposed unwanted infants on hillsides to die, that they slaughtered thousands in gladiatorial games for entertainment, that their own religious practices included animal sacrifice and the occasional human offering. The logic didn't have to be consistent, it just had to preserve the narrative. But slowly, gradually, a new generation of scholars began asking different questions. What if we stopped assuming Roman sources were objective? What if we read them the way we'd read any victor's propaganda with skepticism and awareness of bias? What if we tried to reconstruct Carthaginian history from archaeology and the few non-Roman sources that survived, Greek accounts, Phoenician inscriptions, even passages in the Hebrew Bible that mentioned Carthaginian cities? French archaeologists, working in what was now their colony, had particular motivation to challenge Roman narratives. They'd seen firsthand what colonizers did to the histories of conquered peoples, how occupiers rewrote the past to justify the present. The parallels weren't lost on them. Just as France was busy telling Algerians and Tunisians that French civilization was superior to their own cultures, Rome had told the world that Roman civilization was superior to Carthaginian culture. The method was the same: conquest first, historical justification afterward. By the early 20th century, a more nuanced picture began to emerge in academic literature. Carthage was increasingly understood as a maritime commercial republic, different from Rome but not inferior to it, with its own strengths and weaknesses, its own achievements and failures. The child sacrifice debate remained contentious, but even scholars who accepted that it happened began placing it in broader context. Every ancient society practiced forms of human sacrifice in extreme circumstances, the Romans included. The question wasn't whether Carthaginians were uniquely barbaric, but whether they were significantly different from their neighbours. The public, however, was slower to change. Popular histories and school textbooks continued teaching the old narratives well into the 20th century. Hannibal remained the villain, Carthage the treacherous enemy, Rome the righteous victor. It's easier to teach simple stories than complicated truths, easier to have clear heroes and villains than to acknowledge that history is usually written by people with agendas, that the sources we trust might be propaganda, that empires destroy their enemies and then destroy their memories. What made the revision of Carthaginian history particularly significant was what it revealed about historiography itself, about how we know what we claim to know about the past. For Carthage, we had almost no primary sources, no Carthaginian historians writing in Punic, no archives of government documents, no literary tradition. Everything we knew came from Greeks and Romans who were either competitors or conquerors. It was like trying to understand America by reading only Soviet histories, or trying to understand the Nazis by reading only their descriptions of themselves. The bias was inherent, unavoidable, and for 2,000 years, mostly unquestioned. Archaeology offered a corrective, a way to hear voices the textual sources silenced. Every foundation stone uncovered, every pottery shard analysed, every inscription translated was a small act of resurrection, bringing back a civilization that Rome had tried to erase. The Carthaginians couldn't speak for themselves anymore. Their language barely survived. Their literature was ash. But their buildings remained, their harbours, their walls, their coins with Punic inscriptions, their humble household objects that spoke of ordinary lives lived in extraordinary times. The academic response to Carthage's rediscovery became a case study in how difficult it is to revise established narratives, how much resistance there is to questioning foundational myths, how long it takes for new evidence to overcome old assumptions. Even now, even with over a century of archaeological work, the popular imagination still defaults to Roman perspectives. Mention Carthage and most people think of Hannibal, the enemy, not of the Purple City with its sophisticated harbours and cosmopolitan culture. But among scholars, something shifted. The excavations forced a reckoning with how history gets written, who gets to tell it, and what happens to civilizations whose stories are told only by their conquerors. Carthage became a reminder that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that silence in the historical record might mean destruction rather than insignificance, that the gaps in our knowledge are often where the most important stories hide. The earth was giving back what Rome had taken. And slowly, grudgingly, the historians began to listen. The problem with Carthage has always been the gap between what we were told and what actually was, between Roman legends and archaeological reality, between propaganda and truth. For 2,000 years the legend stood unchallenged. Carthage as the cruel maritime empire, rich beyond measure but morally bankrupt, a society of merchants without honour, of priests who burned children, of generals who used mercenaries because Carthaginians were too soft and profit-obsessed to fight their own battles. This was the Carthage of Roman memory, the Carthage that deserved to burn. But the ruins told a different story. They revealed a city not of decadent merchants, but of practical engineers, not of barbarous child killers, but of sophisticated urban planners who built drainage systems and public fountains and harbours that represented the cutting edge of ancient technology. The contradiction was stark, undeniable, and it raised uncomfortable questions. If the Romans had lied about Carthaginian engineering, What else had they lied about? If they'd exaggerated Carthaginian weakness, had they also exaggerated Carthaginian cruelty? And if Carthage wasn't the villain of this story, what did that make Rome? Consider the legend of Carthaginian perfidy. The Roman claim that Carthaginians were chronic treaty breakers, untrustworthy in diplomacy, dishonourable in war. This became a cornerstone of Roman justification for the Punic Wars. The Romans presented themselves as reluctant warriors, forced into conflict by Carthaginian aggression and deception. But when you examine the actual historical record, the pattern that emerges is quite different. The First Punic War started when Rome intervened in Sicily, breaking an existing treaty that had defined Carthage's sphere of influence. The Second Punic War was triggered by Rome's interference in Iberia, where Carthage had been expanding for decades. The Third Punic War began when Rome manufactured a diplomatic crisis specifically to justify attacking a city that no longer posed any military threat. In each case, Rome was the aggressor, but Roman historians spun it differently. They emphasized Carthaginian provocations, real or imagined, and downplayed Roman expansionism. They portrayed every Carthaginian defensive action as aggression, every attempt to protect existing territories as treaty violation. The technique was brilliant, effective, and it worked for 2 millennia. Only when scholars began reading these sources critically, comparing them to archaeology and to Greek accounts that were slightly less biased, did the contradictions become visible. Or consider the legend of Carthaginian military weakness, the claim that Carthage relied on mercenaries because its citizens were too comfortable, too focused on trade, too unmartial to fight. Roman writers, especially Livy and Polybius, made much of this, contrasting soft Carthaginian merchants with hardy Roman farmers who fought for love of homeland. But the archaeological evidence suggests something different. Carthaginian military installations were extensive, sophisticated, and designed for a professional standing army, not a citizen militia. The famous naval harbour could house over 200 warships, each requiring a trained crew of 300 men. That's 60,000 trained sailors and marines, maintained year-round, drawn from a city of 400,000 people. The mathematics alone suggest a society deeply militarised, not one that avoided warfare. The truth, which emerges from careful analysis, is that Carthage used a mixed military system entirely typical of ancient Mediterranean powers. They had citizen soldiers, particularly in the navy, where Carthaginian citizens served as officers and skilled sailors. They supplemented these with professional soldiers from their territories, Libyan infantry, Numidian cavalry, Iberian, swordsmen, troops who fought for Carthage because they were part of the Carthaginian system, subjects or allies or long-term professional soldiers. Yes, they hired mercenaries when needed, especially for campaigns far from home, but so did Rome. Rome's Italian allies provided half of every Roman army. Were they mercenaries? The distinction blurred when examined honestly. Then there's the legend of child sacrifice, the most persistent and most controversial. Roman sources claim the Carthaginians regularly sacrificed their own children to Baal Hammon, particularly in times of crisis when they needed divine favour. The descriptions were lurid, designed to horrify, presenting Carthage as a society so morally degraded that infanticide was state policy. And the Tophet seemed to confirm it, thousands of infant burials in a sacred precinct dedicated to the chief gods. But here's where archaeology and legend diverge most sharply. Modern analysis of the remains shows that many, perhaps most, of the infants in the Tophet were newborns or stillborn, children who died of natural causes or were born dead. The urns often contained animal bones as well, suggesting substitution was common, that families could offer a lamb instead of a child. Some urns do contain older children, raising the possibility that sacrifice happened occasionally, perhaps in extreme circumstances, perhaps when a family had made a desperate vow. But the pattern doesn't match Roman descriptions of routine mass sacrifice. What the Tophet actually represents, most modern scholars believe, is a specialised cemetery for infants who died before they reached an age where they could be buried in adult cemeteries, combined with a sacred space where families made offerings to ensure the child's safe passage to the afterlife. This would make it similar to infant burial grounds in other ancient cultures, Greeks, Etruscans, even early Romans, all of whom handled infant death differently from adult death. The Carthaginians buried these children with honour, with ritual, in a sacred precinct under divine protection. The Romans saw this through their own cultural lens, misunderstood it or deliberately misrepresented it, and created a legend of monstrous barbarism. None of this means Carthage was innocent or that Roman criticisms were entirely fabricated. Carthage was an empire. Empires are built on violence and exploitation, and Carthage certainly had blood on its hands. But the contradictions reveal something important about how history gets written. The Romans created a version of Carthage that justified what they did to it, and that version became history. The real Carthage, the one we glimpse through archaeology, was more complicated, more human, more like Rome than Rome wanted to admit. Perhaps that's why Rome worked so hard to erase Carthaginian memory. It's easier to destroy a monster than a mirror. It's easier to justify obliterating a city of child sacrifices than acknowledging you destroyed a rival civilization that was in many ways more sophisticated than your own. The legend served Rome's purposes. The reality buried under Tunisian soil for 2,000 years serves truth. And truth, however uncomfortable, however late in arriving, matters. It matters that we know the difference between what Rome said and what actually happened. It matters that we understand how victors write history, how they create villains to justify their victories, how they bury evidence that contradicts their narratives. Because the technique didn't end with Carthage. Every empire since has done the same, destroyed its enemies and then destroyed their stories, replaced reality with convenient legends, and called it history. The ruins of Carthage remind us to question what we're told, especially when we're told it by conquerors. As archaeological evidence accumulated throughout the 20th century, historians began proposing competing theories about what Carthage actually was, what it represented in the ancient Mediterranean world, and why it came into such catastrophic conflict with Rome. These weren't just academic debates about ancient history. They were arguments about the nature of empire, about commerce versus conquest, about whether civilizations could coexist, or whether competition inevitably led to annihilation. The arguments continue today, shaped by new discoveries and by our contemporary understanding of power and conflict. The traditional theory, inherited from Roman sources and taught for centuries, portrayed Carthage as essentially a commercial entity accidentally thrust into political power. According to this view, Carthaginians were merchants, traders, profit-seekers who built an empire not out of territorial ambition, but out of commercial necessity. They needed ports, they needed resources, they needed protected trade routes, so they established colonies and made alliances and occasionally conquered territories, but always in service of commerce. War, in this theory, was something Carthage reluctantly engaged in when trade was threatened, and they were never very good at it because their heart wasn't in military glory. This theory fit Roman prejudices perfectly. It allowed Roman historians to portray Carthage as a society of shopkeepers, people who valued money over honour, profit over patriotism, convenience over courage. The Romans, who prided themselves on military virtue and civic duty, found this contemptible. Better to die gloriously in battle than to live comfortably through trade, or so the Roman value system insisted. This theory also explained, conveniently, why Rome had to destroy Carthage rather than simply defeating it. You couldn't trust merchants to honour treaties or to accept defeat gracefully. Their loyalty was to profit, not to principle. But a counter-theory emerged as scholars examined the archaeological evidence more carefully. This theory proposed that Carthage was actually a thalassocracy, a sea empire, comparable to later Venice or maritime Athens, a state whose power rested on control of trade routes and naval supremacy, but which was nonetheless a genuine imperial power, with territorial ambitions and sophisticated political structures. According to this view, Carthaginian commerce wasn't separate from Carthaginian power, it was the foundation of it. Trade created wealth, wealth built fleets, fleets secured more trade routes, and the cycle reinforced itself until Carthage controlled the Western Mediterranean not accidentally but systematically. This theory, advanced particularly by French and British scholars in the mid-20th century, portrayed Carthaginians as rational imperialists who understood that economic power and military power were inseparable, that controlling trade meant controlling territory, that protecting merchants required naval dominance and diplomatic alliances, and, when necessary, military intervention. They were good at war, this theory argued, particularly naval warfare, and their use of professional armies wasn't weakness but strategic sophistication. Why waste citizen lives when you could hire excellent soldiers from allied territories? Why develop heavy infantry when your true strength was cavalry and naval superiority? A third theory, more recent and more controversial, suggests that the conflict between Rome and Carthage was fundamentally about incompatible systems of power. Rome was a land-based, agricultural, conquest-oriented society that valued military glory and territorial expansion. Carthage was a maritime, commercial, network-based power that valued trade connections and naval control. These systems could coexist when both powers were small, when treaties could divide spheres of influence cleanly. But as both expanded, as Roman territory spread toward the sea and Carthaginian interest required more territorial depth, the systems became incompatible. War wasn't inevitable because of Carthaginian treachery or Roman aggression. It was inevitable because two different models of Mediterranean dominance couldn't occupy the same space. This theory has gained traction among modern historians because it explains why the Punic Wars were so long, so bitter, and ultimately so total. It wasn't just about Sicily or Spain or commercial rivalry. It was about which system would define the Mediterranean world going forward. Would the future belong to networks of trade cities connected by sea routes, each autonomous but linked by commercial interests? Or would it belong to territorial empires expanding outward from a single centre, conquering and assimilating everything they touched? Carthage represented the former, Rome the latter. Only one model could survive. Some Marxist historians proposed an economic theory, arguing that the Punic Wars were essentially conflicts between different modes of production, between Carthaginian commercial capitalism and Roman agrarian aristocracy. Carthage, in this view, represented an early form of merchant capitalism where wealth came from trade and finance rather than land ownership. Rome represented traditional agricultural economy, where land and military service were the basis of citizenship and power. The conflict was class-based, economic, about which elite would dominate the Mediterranean, merchant princes or landed aristocrats. This theory had the advantage of explaining why the wars were so economically devastating, why neither side could accept anything less than total victory. Compromise would have required one system to subordinate itself to the other, which neither elite class could accept. It also explained Rome's particularly thorough destruction of Carthage, not just defeating a rival, but eliminating an alternative economic model, ensuring that the Mediterranean would develop along Roman rather than Carthaginian lines. More recently, post-colonial historians have proposed that we should understand Carthage not through European frameworks at all, but as an African power, the last great indigenous civilization of North Africa before European and Middle Eastern powers came to dominate the region. This theory emphasizes Carthage's African connections, its trade with sub-Saharan kingdoms, its incorporation of Libyan and Numidian peoples into Carthaginian society, its role as a bridge between Mediterranean and African worlds. The Punic Wars in this reading were the first stage of Africa's colonization, Rome's initial conquest of African territory, the beginning of 2,000 years of European control. This perspective challenges the traditional classification of Carthage as essentially Phoenician, therefore Asian, therefore non-African despite its location. It points out that by the time of the Punic Wars, Carthage had been in Africa for 6 centuries, had intermarried with African peoples, had incorporated African gods into Carthaginian religion, had relied on African soldiers and African resources. Carthage was as African as it was Phoenician, perhaps more so, and its destruction was an African tragedy as much as a Mediterranean one. Each theory offers insights, each captures part of the truth. Carthage was a commercial power, it was a sea empire. It did represent an alternative model of Mediterranean organization. It was economically distinct from Rome, and it was an African civilization. Perhaps the error is thinking we need to choose one theory, one explanation. Perhaps Carthage was all these things, complex and multifaceted, and that's precisely why it fascinates us, why we keep returning to its ruins, why we keep trying to understand what was lost when Rome salted the earth. The debates continue. New archaeological discoveries spark new theories. Old questions remain unanswered. But through the arguments and analysis, through the competing interpretations and revised conclusions, Carthage slowly comes back into focus, still blurred around the edges, still mysterious, but increasingly visible, increasingly real. Understanding Carthage requires something like detective work, sifting through evidence that's incomplete, biased, and often deliberately misleading. The investigation began in the 19th century when archaeologists started excavating Tunisian soil, but the real breakthrough came when historians began treating Roman sources not as objective history, but as evidence requiring verification, as accounts that needed to be cross-examined and fact-checked against archaeology, against Greek sources, against the physical evidence that couldn't be rewritten by victors. The method became systematic in the mid-20th century. Scholars would take a Roman claim about Carthage, something specific and verifiable, and then search for archaeological or independent textual evidence that either confirmed or contradicted it. The results were revealing. Some Roman claims proved accurate, others were exaggerations, and some were demonstrably false. The pattern that emerged was exactly what you'd expect from wartime propaganda. Enough truth to seem credible, enough distortion to serve political purposes, enough omission to hide inconvenient realities. Take Roman descriptions of the Carthaginian navy. Roman sources, particularly Polybius, described Carthaginian ships in considerable detail, their design, their tactics, their weaknesses. When archaeologists discovered ancient shipwrecks off Sicily and analysed their construction, Polybius proved remarkably accurate. The Carthaginians did use quinquiremes, just 5 banked warships powered by 300 rowers. They did favour ramming tactics. They did build ships faster than Romans because they used prefabricated sections, an assembly line technique that allowed them to produce fleets in weeks rather than months. On technical matters, when Roman authors had no political reason to lie, they were often reliable. But when Roman sources described Carthaginian government, the accounts became suspicious. Romans claimed Carthage was corrupt, that positions were bought and sold, that generals were executed for failure, that the constitution was unstable and factional. Yet archaeology revealed a government that lasted 600 years with remarkable consistency, that managed a far-flung empire with apparent efficiency, that built massive public works requiring centralised planning and sustained funding. The contradiction suggested Roman bias. Of course, Romans would portray Carthaginian government as corrupt and unstable. It justified Roman intervention. It made Roman republicanism seem superior by comparison. So investigators turned to Greek sources, particularly Aristotle, who had no stake in Roman-Carthaginian conflicts and who studied comparative government systematically. Aristotle described the Carthaginian constitution as one of the best in the Mediterranean world, praising its stability and its balance between aristocratic and democratic elements. This contradicted Roman characterizations completely. Either Aristotle was wrong, or Romans were lying. Given that Aristotle wrote centuries before the Punic Wars and had no reason to flatter Carthage, historians increasingly trusted his account over Roman propaganda. The investigation of child sacrifice proved most difficult because the evidence was genuinely ambiguous. Roman sources were unanimous and detailed in their accusations. Greek sources mentioned it occasionally. The Tophet existed, full of infant remains. But modern forensic analysis of the bones told a more complicated story. Many infants showed no signs of violent death. Many were newborns or stillborn. The animal bones mixed in suggested substitution was common. And comparative religious studies show that every Mediterranean culture, including Rome, practiced some form of child offering in extreme circumstances, exposure of unwanted infants, gladiatorial sacrifices, devotio where commanders sacrificed themselves and enemy soldiers to the gods. What emerged from careful investigation was that Carthaginian religious practices probably did include occasional child sacrifice, particularly in moments of extreme crisis, wars going badly, plagues, famines, but that this was neither routine nor unique, and that Roman sources had exaggerated both the frequency and the cruelty involved. The Tophet was primarily a sacred cemetery for infants who died naturally, where grieving families could ensure proper religious rites. Sometimes, perhaps, it was also a place where desperate families made terrible sacrifices. Both things could be true simultaneously. Investigators also examined Roman economic claims, the assertion that Carthaginian wealth came primarily from exploiting others, from trade monopolies and tribute extraction. Archaeological surveys of Carthaginian territory in North Africa, Sicily and Iberia revealed a more complex picture. Yes, Carthage extracted resources and controlled trade routes, but Carthaginian colonies also developed local agriculture, built infrastructure, established markets that enriched local populations. The relationship wasn't simple exploitation. It was more like a commercial network where Carthage provided security and access to markets in exchange for resources and loyalty. Roman claims about Carthaginian military incompetence similarly crumbled under investigation. Yes, Carthage lost 2 of the 3 Punic Wars. But in the First Punic War, they fought Rome to a standstill for 23 years, controlling Sicily for most of that time, and only lost when Rome built a fleet that matched Carthaginian naval superiority. In the Second Punic War, Hannibal invaded Italy, destroyed 4 Roman armies including the catastrophic defeat at Cannae, and remained undefeated on Italian soil for 15 years. This was the military record of incompetent merchants. The truth was that Carthage was excellent at naval warfare and cavalry tactics, weaker in heavy infantry battles where Roman legions excelled. Different strengths, not inferior ones. Rome won ultimately because of superior manpower reserves, because Roman citizens accepted staggering casualties that would have broken other states, because Rome could lose battle after battle and still raise new armies, while Carthage, dependent on professional soldiers and allied contingents, couldn't replace losses as easily. This wasn't incompetence, it was demographics. Investigators found that almost every major Roman criticism of Carthage, when examined carefully, revealed more about Roman values and prejudices than about Carthaginian reality. Romans valued military glory, so they portrayed Carthaginian commerce as shameful. Romans valued citizen soldiers, so they portrayed Carthaginian professionals as inferior. Romans valued territorial conquest, so they portrayed Carthaginian naval empire as somehow less legitimate. The investigation revealed the criticism as projection, Romans defining themselves by contrasting themselves with a distorted image of their enemy. Perhaps the most important discovery was what Romans simply omitted from their accounts. They rarely mention Carthaginian art, architecture, literature, or philosophy, because acknowledging cultural sophistication would undermine the barbarian narrative. They downplayed Carthaginian technological innovations, because admitting Carthaginian superiority in engineering would contradict claims of Roman civilizational supremacy. They ignored evidence of Carthaginian religious tolerance, humanitarian treatment of conquered peoples, or diplomatic skill because it complicated the story of Roman moral superiority. Modern investigation, using archaeology and critical source analysis, has painstakingly reconstructed what Romans tried to hide. It's slow work, frustrating work, full of gaps and uncertainties, but piece by piece, burial by burial, inscription by inscription, the real Carthage emerges from beneath the rubble of Roman lies. Not perfect, not innocent, but real, human, complex, worthy of being remembered as something more than the villain in Rome's story. If you want to understand Carthage, start with the harbours, not with battles or treaties or the arguments of ancient historians, but with the physical evidence of what the Carthaginians actually built, with the engineering that survives 2,000 years after the city burned. The harbours tell a story that no Roman propaganda can obscure, a story of sophisticated planning, of technological mastery, of a society that understood the sea in ways their enemies never quite matched. The main harbour complex consisted of 2 massive circular basins connected by a narrow channel, the whole system protected from storms by breakwaters and from enemies by walls and chains that could seal the entrance. The outer harbour, the commercial one, stretched over 7 acres, its quays lined with warehouses and loading docks, where merchant ships from across the Mediterranean unloaded silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, purple-dyed textiles from Tyre, ivory from beyond the Sahara. The scale was immense. Hundreds of ships could anchor there simultaneously, protected from weather, with customs officials and merchants and slaves moving cargo in an operation that must have resembled a modern port in its complexity. But it was the inner harbour, the military one, that truly demonstrated Carthaginian engineering genius. This circular basin, about 1,000 feet in diameter, was ringed with covered ship sheds, dry docks where warships could be built, repaired, and stored out of sight. At the centre rose a circular island where the admiral's headquarters commanded a view of the entire facility. Each ship shed was precisely designed to house a quinquereme, with columns supporting a peaked roof that protected the vessel from sun and rain, while leaving room for workers to move around it. 220 ships could be maintained here, ready to launch at a moment's notice, an instant fleet that could dominate the western Mediterranean. The sophistication of the design becomes clear when you consider the problems it solved. Ancient warships were fragile, their wooden hulls rotted if left in water too long, Their joints weakened, their seams opened. Most navies had to beach their ships and rebuild them frequently, a slow, expensive process. The Carthaginians built covered docks with proper drainage, where ships could be stored upright on rollers, kept dry but ready to launch down slipways directly into the harbour. This meant a Carthaginian fleet could go from storage to combat readiness in hours rather than weeks, a strategic advantage that archaeology has confirmed and Roman sources grudgingly acknowledged. The excavations reveal details that ancient texts never mentioned. The floors of the ship sheds were paved with waterproof cement, an early form of hydraulic concrete that hardened underwater. The drainage channels were precisely graded to carry rainwater away without flooding the slipways. The warehouses adjacent to the military harbour were designed for specific purposes, one for sails and rigging, another for weapons and armour, a third for pitch and materials needed for repairs. This wasn't improvised. This was systematic, the result of centuries of accumulated nautical knowledge applied with engineering precision. Then there are the walls, the fortifications that ringed Carthage and made it effectively impregnable until the Romans finally breached them in 146 BC. These walls ran for over 20 miles around the peninsula, in some sections rising 70 feet high and 30 feet thick. They were triple-layered in the most vulnerable areas, with an outer wall, a middle defensive corridor, and an inner wall creating a defensive system that could house thousands of soldiers and withstand prolonged siege. Archaeological excavations have traced these walls, found their foundations driven deep into bedrock, found the towers spaced at regular intervals, found the barracks built into the walls themselves. The sheer scale is staggering when you stand among the ruins. These walls required millions of cut stones, precisely fitted, transported from quarries miles away, lifted into place by pulleys and ramps and human labour counted in decades. The foundations alone represent an engineering challenge that matched anything in the ancient world. And this was just one element of Carthage's defences. The harbours were fortified separately. The approaches to the city were guarded by forts and watchtowers. The whole peninsula was designed as an integrated defensive system that could be held by a relatively small force against a much larger army. The ships themselves left evidence in unexpected places. Underwater archaeology off the coast of Sicily has recovered Carthaginian warships sunk during naval battles, their wooden hulls preserved in silt. Analysis revealed construction techniques that were startlingly advanced. The Carthaginians used prefabricated sections, hull pieces built to standard measurements that could be assembled quickly, like the components of modern ships. They used copper sheathing on the hulls to prevent marine growth, a technique that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. They incorporated design features borrowed from Greek triremes and Egyptian cargo vessels, adapting the best ideas from across the Mediterranean. The archaeological evidence extends beyond military installations. Excavations in the residential quarters revealed homes with sophisticated plumbing, lead pipes bringing fresh water from aqueducts into private courtyards, drainage systems carrying waste away to underground sewers. The streets were paved with precisely fitted stones, graded for drainage, wide enough for carts to pass. Public fountains provided water to neighbourhoods, maintained by the city government. This was urban planning at a level that matched Hellenistic cities, that in some ways exceeded what Rome achieved until the imperial period. The evidence is everywhere once you know how to look for it. In the pottery workshops where standardised amphorae were mass-produced for the wine and oil trade, each stamped with marks identifying contents and origin, a supply chain management system that facilitated commerce across thousands of miles. In the metalworking districts where copper from Cyprus and tin from distant islands were alloyed into bronze, where iron tools were manufactured using techniques learned from Iberian smiths. In the textile factories where Tyrian purple was produced from murex shells, the stinking vats still visible as purple stains in the limestone 2,000 years later. Every artefact, every foundation stone, every broken column tells the same story. This was a sophisticated urban civilization, technologically advanced, economically powerful, capable of planning and executing projects on a scale that required centralized government, accumulated knowledge, and sustained investment. The Romans could write whatever they wanted about Carthaginian barbarism. The ruins don't lie, the harbours don't lie, the walls don't lie, and what they say in stone and concrete and the traces of vanished ships is that Carthage was magnificent, that it was built to last forever, that the people who designed these harbours, who raised these walls, who engineered these ship sheds, believed they were creating something eternal, a city that would command the Mediterranean for centuries to come. They were wrong, tragically wrong, but their mistake wasn't in their capabilities. It was in underestimating how completely an enemy could hate, how thoroughly a victor could destroy, how long a civilization could be forgotten. But now the evidence speaks, and it demands that we remember. The deeper you dig into Carthaginian history, the more you realize that the true mystery isn't what happened. We know that Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, but why the destruction was so complete, so deliberate, so thorough that for 2,000 years an entire civilization existed only as a footnote in someone else's story. This wasn't normal conquest. This was erasure, systematic and calculated, and understanding why requires looking beyond military history into something darker about human nature and imperial power. Consider what Rome did after the Third Punic War ended. They'd already won. Carthage had surrendered unconditionally, delivered hostages, handed over weapons, agreed to every Roman demand. The city was defenceless, its fleet destroyed, its territories already occupied by Roman forces. At this point, typical ancient conquest would have involved installing a friendly government, perhaps taking tribute, maybe establishing a Roman garrison. Instead, the Roman Senate ordered the city's complete destruction. Not defeat, destruction. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of the Scipio who defeated Hannibal at Zama, commanded the final assault. For 6 days, Roman soldiers fought house to house through Carthaginian streets while the city burned around them. 50,000 Carthaginians who survived the fighting were sold into slavery. The Romans then spent 17 more days systematically demolishing everything that remained, pulling down walls, smashing temples, breaking aqueducts, filling in the harbours with rubble. According to legend, they ploughed the ruins and scattered salt so nothing would grow, though modern historians doubt the salt part. They didn't need to salt the earth, the destruction was already total. But that was just the physical erasure. The cultural erasure went further. The Romans confiscated Carthaginian libraries, 28 volumes on agriculture they kept and translated because they were useful. Everything else they burned or scattered. The language, Punic, survived only in isolated pockets, gradually dying out over the next few centuries as Latin became the lingua franca of Roman North Africa. The religion was banned, temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit destroyed, priests killed or scattered, sacred texts burned. Within a generation, Carthaginian culture was effectively extinct. The mystery is why. Rome had defeated other powerful enemies without erasing them completely. They'd conquered the Greek city-states but preserved Greek culture, even admired it, incorporated it into Roman civilization. They defeated the Gauls but didn't try to eliminate Celtic language and culture. They fought repeated wars with the Samnites, the Etruscans, various Italian tribes, but eventually absorbed them into the Roman system rather than obliterating them. What made Carthage different? Why did Rome feel the need to not just conquer, but erase? Some historians point to the sheer terror Hannibal had inspired. For 15 years, from 218 to 203 BC, he'd rampaged through Italy, destroying Roman armies, devastating the countryside, proving that Rome wasn't invincible. The Romans never forgot that fear, never forgave that humiliation. Even after they defeated Hannibal, even after they defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War, the memory lingered. As long as Carthage existed, as long as the city stood on the African coast, Rome couldn't feel truly safe. The psychological wound was too deep. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to admit but perhaps more truthful. Maybe Rome destroyed Carthage so completely because Carthage represented an alternative, a different way of organizing Mediterranean power, and Rome couldn't tolerate that alternative continuing to exist even as a memory. Carthage was a maritime commercial empire. Rome was a terrestrial conquest empire. Carthage valued trade. Rome valued military glory. Carthage used professional armies. Rome used citizen soldiers. Carthage governed through elected councils. Rome through aristocratic consensus. The systems were fundamentally incompatible. As long as Carthage existed, even as a defeated rival, it posed an ideological threat. It suggested that Rome's way wasn't the only way, that empire could be built through commerce rather than conquest, that naval power could rival land power, that that professional soldiers could match citizen militias. By obliterating Carthage, by erasing it so thoroughly that only Roman accounts remained, Rome eliminated not just a rival, but a rival idea, a competing vision of how Mediterranean civilization could be organized. This also explains why the Romans were so systematic in their cultural erasure. It wasn't enough to destroy the city, they had to destroy the memory, control the narrative, ensure that future generations would know Carthage only through Roman texts, only as the enemy, the barbarian, the child-sacrificing merchants who deserved their fate. If Carthaginian histories survived, if Carthaginian literature remained, if Carthaginian voices could speak for themselves, they might tell a different story, might challenge Roman justifications, might preserve that dangerous alternative vision. The erasure was so successful that for 2,000 years it worked. Scholars read Livy and Polybius and assumed they were reading objective history. Artists painted Hannibal as a villain and Scipio as a hero. Teachers used Carthage as an example of what happens to civilizations that value profit over virtue, commerce over martial valor. The Roman version became the only version, accepted, unquestioned, canonical. Only archaeology broke the spell, and even that took centuries. The ruins had to be excavated, the evidence had to be analysed, the Roman narratives had to be questioned, all of which required intellectual courage and scholarly persistence. Even now, even with over a century of archaeological work, the popular imagination still defaults to Roman characterizations. Carthage remains, for most people, just the enemy Rome defeated, not a civilization worth knowing in its own right. That's the deeper mystery, not what Rome did to Carthage, but what Carthage's erasure reveals about power and memory and the fragility of history. Every civilization that's ever been destroyed by a more powerful neighbour has faced the same threat. The threat that their conqueror will control their story, will tell future generations who they were and what they deserved, will erase their voices and replace them with propaganda. Carthage wasn't the first civilization to disappear this way, and it wasn't the last. But because the erasure was so complete, because we can trace exactly how it happened, because archaeology has given us glimpses of what was lost, Carthage has become a kind of memorial to all the civilizations whose stories were buried by their conquerors. It reminds us that absence from history books doesn't mean insignificance, that silence might mean murder rather than obscurity, that what we don't know about the past might be the most important part. The ruins whisper what Rome tried to silence, and in that whisper is a warning that empires don't just conquer territory, they conquer memory, and the greatest victory is making the defeated disappear so completely that no one remembers they ever existed at all. There's a moment in every empire's story when everything changes, when the trajectory that seemed inevitable suddenly bends toward an outcome no one predicted. For Carthage, for Rome, for the entire Mediterranean world, that moment came in the autumn of 218 BC, when a 29-year-old Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca stood in the Pyrenees with an army of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, and decided to do something that military experts considered impossible. He decided to invade Italy by marching over the Alps. The audacity was breathtaking. The Alps in October were already touched by snow, the passes treacherous with ice and rock slides, the mountain tribes, hostile to strangers, the paths barely wide enough for a single-file column, let alone an entire army with baggage trains and elephants. No one had ever brought an army across the Alps. Everyone said it couldn't be done. Roman military planners assumed they were safe from land invasion, that any war with Carthage would be fought in Spain or Africa or on the seas, not in Italy itself. Hannibal proved them catastrophically wrong. He'd planned it for years, from the moment he'd taken command of Carthaginian forces in Spain, perhaps even earlier, from the moment his father Hamilcar had made him, as a 9-year-old boy, swear eternal hatred of Rome before the altar of Carthaginian gods. Hannibal had spent his entire youth preparing for this, studying Roman tactics, training professional soldiers, building alliances with Spanish tribes, accumulating resources. The crossing of the Alps wasn't reckless improvisation, it was calculated shock tactics, designed to do what conventional strategy couldn't, to bring the war directly to Roman territory, to prove that Rome wasn't invulnerable. The march itself was nightmare and triumph combined. It took 15 days to cross the mountains, 15 days of fighting hostile tribes, of navigating narrow paths where a single misstep meant falling thousands of feet, of watching men and animals freeze to death in unexpected snowstorms. The elephants, those magnificent weapons that had terrified Roman armies in previous wars, suffered terribly. Most died on the mountain paths, freezing or starving or falling when the trails collapsed beneath their weight. Of the 37 that entered the Alps, only a handful survived to reach Italy. The army suffered equally. Men fell from exhaustion, from cold, from altitude sickness that left them gasping and disoriented. Mountain tribes rolled boulders down on the column, attacking when the Carthaginians were most vulnerable, stretched along narrow paths with no room to maneuver. Hannibal lost nearly half his army in those mountains, 40,000 men dead or deserted, a catastrophic loss that would have broken a lesser commander. But what emerged from the Alps, battered and reduced but triumphant, was something the Romans hadn't prepared for. A veteran army led by a military genius, positioned in the heart of Roman territory, ready to turn everything upside down. The Romans couldn't believe it at first. Scouts reported a Carthaginian army descending from the Alps into the Po Valley, and Roman commanders thought it must be a small raiding force, maybe a few thousand men who'd somehow crossed by a single pass. When they realized it was Hannibal's entire army, that he'd accomplished the impossible, that there was now a hostile force in Italy itself, the panic was immediate. Rome had assumed they would fight this war in Spain. They'd sent one army to Spain under the general Scipio, father of the Scipio who would eventually defeat Hannibal. Now they had to scramble to defend their own heartland. The psychological impact was perhaps even more significant than the tactical surprise. Rome had built its power on the assumption that Italy was inviolable, that Roman territory was safe, that wars happened elsewhere, in foreign lands, far from Roman farms and cities. Hannibal shattered that assumption in a single audacious march. Suddenly Rome was the invaded, not the invader. Roman citizens faced enemy soldiers devastating their countryside. Roman confidence cracked, and Hannibal exploited that crack brilliantly. He understood that he couldn't defeat Rome by siege. He didn't have the numbers or the resources for that. But he could erode Roman power by encouraging defection, by offering better terms to Rome's Italian allies, by demonstrating that Rome couldn't protect them. The tribes of northern Italy, many recently conquered by Rome and still resentful, flocked to Hannibal's banner. The Gauls, in particular, who'd been fighting Roman expansion for generations, saw Hannibal as a liberator and provided thousands of fresh troops to replace the men he'd lost in the Alps. Within months of entering Italy, Hannibal fought and won 2 major battles, at the Ticinus River and then at Trebia, destroying Roman armies that had been sent to stop him. The victories weren't just military, they were political. Every Roman defeat encouraged more defections, more allied cities questioning whether Roman protection was worth the cost. Hannibal was unravelling the Italian confederation that was the foundation of Roman power, showing that Rome's allies were held by force and fear, not by loyalty. The turning point wasn't just Hannibal's success, it was Rome's response. A lesser power would have sued for peace after such disasters, would have acknowledged that an enemy capable of crossing the Alps and winning battles on Italian soil couldn't be easily defeated. But Rome didn't surrender, didn't even negotiate. They raised new armies, appointed new generals, and prepared to fight on. The Senate passed measures forbidding any discussion of peace as long as Hannibal remained in Italy. This wasn't pragmatism, it was pride, Roman refusal to accept defeat no matter the cost. And so the war became existential. Hannibal had wanted to force Rome to accept Carthaginian dominance in Spain and the western Mediterranean. Rome responded by committing to total victory or total defeat. There was no middle ground anymore, no diplomatic solution, no negotiated settlement. One of these powers would destroy the other. The crossing of the Alps had made that inevitable. For 15 years, Hannibal would remain in Italy, undefeated in battle, devastating the countryside, winning impossible victories, proving himself one of history's greatest military commanders. For 15 years, Rome would refuse to quit, would absorb losses that would have destroyed any other state, would keep raising armies and sending them against Hannibal, even after catastrophic defeats. The war would spread across the Mediterranean, drawing in kingdoms and cities from Spain to Greece. But it all started with one decision, one impossible march, one moment when a young Carthaginian general stood in the mountains and chose to do what everyone said couldn't be done. That moment changed everything. It revealed what Carthage was capable of, what Rome was made of, and set both civilizations on a collision course that could only end with one of them erased from history. Close your eyes. Picture those elephants on icy mountain paths, struggling upward toward passes touched with early snow. Picture the soldiers looking down at Italy spread below, green and rich and defended by an enemy that didn't yet know they were coming. Picture Hannibal at the front, young and fierce and absolutely certain, leading his men toward a destiny that would make him immortal and doom his city to oblivion. The turning point, the moment everything changed. The Punic Wars lasted over a century, 3 separate conflicts spread across 118 years, each one more brutal than the last, each one bringing Carthage closer to annihilation. Together they form one of history's great tragedies, the slow-motion destruction of a civilization that might have survived, that almost won, that made fatal mistakes at crucial moments and paid for them with everything. Understanding these 3 wars means understanding not just military history, but the terrible logic of imperial rivalry, the way conflicts that start over territory can escalate into wars of total extinction. The First Punic War began in 264 BC, almost casually, almost by accident. It started in Sicily, that large island between Italy and Africa, where Greek cities and Carthaginian colonies had coexisted uneasily for centuries. Rome wasn't even a naval power yet. They'd barely fought beyond Italy. But when civil conflict in the Sicilian city of Messana threatened Carthaginian expansion, Rome intervened. Neither side intended total war. Both thought it would be a limited conflict over Sicilian territory, settled in a season or 2. It lasted 23 years. Rome, desperate to match Carthaginian naval superiority, built their first real fleet by copying a captured Carthaginian ship, reproducing it hundreds of times with characteristic Roman thoroughness. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that let their superior infantry turn naval battles into land battles fought on ship decks. The war became a grinding attrition contest, fleet against fleet, battle after battle, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Carthage controlled Sicily for most of the war, but Roman persistence eventually wore them down. The peace treaty of 241 BC should have ended the rivalry. Carthage surrendered Sicily, paid an indemnity, acknowledged Roman power in the central Mediterranean. It was a defeat, certainly, but not a catastrophic one. Carthage still controlled Spain north, Africa, Sardinia, and Corsica. They still had their fleet, their trade networks, their wealth. The empire had survived. But Rome, seeing Carthaginian weakness, violated the treaty almost immediately, seizing Sardinia and Corsica and demanding additional tribute. This wasn't military necessity, it was opportunistic theft, and it planted seeds of hatred that would flower into the Second Punic War. That second war, the one that brought Hannibal across the Alps, lasted from 218 to 201 BC, 17 years of savage fighting that nearly destroyed Rome. Hannibal invaded Italy, won impossible victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, annihilated a Roman army of 80,000 men at Cannae in a battle that became a textbook example of military genius. For 15 years he remained in Italy, undefeated, while Rome lost army after army trying to stop him. Other powers, seeing Rome humbled, joined Carthage, Philip of Macedon, Syracuse, various Italian cities. The Mediterranean coalition against Rome looked unstoppable, but Rome wouldn't quit. They absorbed losses that would have broken any other state, raised new armies when old ones were destroyed, refused even to discuss peace while Hannibal remained on Italian soil, and slowly, painfully, they developed a strategy that worked. They avoided battle with Hannibal himself, harassed his supply lines, prevented reinforcements from reaching him, and opened a second front in Spain where Carthaginian territories were more vulnerable. The Roman general Scipio, later called Africanus, conquered Carthaginian Spain, then invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled to defend his homeland, the first time he'd left Italy in 15 years. At Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio defeated him in a battle that reversed everything Cannae had demonstrated. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were devastating: loss of all territory outside Africa, surrender of the fleet except for 10 ships, an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver paid over 50 years, a prohibition on making war without Roman permission. Carthage became a client state, subordinate to Rome, stripped of military power. Again, this should have been the end. Carthage was defeated, humiliated, effectively neutered as a military threat. They paid the indemnity faithfully, rebuilt their economy through commerce, caused no trouble for Rome, but they survived, and their survival became intolerable to a faction of Roman senators, led by Cato the Elder, who ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146 BC, was barely a war at all. It was an execution disguised as military conflict. Rome manufactured a diplomatic crisis, claimed Carthage had violated the peace terms by defending itself against Numidian raids, demanded impossible concessions. First, hand, over hostages. Carthage complied. Second, surrender all weapons. Carthage complied, delivering 200,000 sets of armour and 2,000 catapults. Third, abandon your city and relocate 10 miles inland, away from the sea. This last demand was a death sentence for a maritime commercial power. Moving inland meant abandoning the harbours, the trade networks, the entire foundation of Carthaginian civilization. Even the most pro-Roman faction in Carthage couldn't accept it. The city chose desperate resistance over slow death, rebuilt walls and weapons and prepared for siege. They held out for 3 years against overwhelming Roman force, fighting house to house, street by street, until starvation and disease did what military assault couldn't. In 146 BC, the city fell. 50,000 survivors were sold as slaves. Everything else was destroyed. The consequence of 3 wars spread across a century was total. Carthage was gone, not just defeated but erased. Its territories absorbed into Roman provinces, its people scattered, its culture obliterated. The western Mediterranean became a Roman lake. No rival remained to challenge Roman expansion. The path was clear for Rome to build an empire that would dominate Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for 5 centuries. But there was another consequence, less obvious but perhaps more profound. The Punic Wars taught Rome that mercy was weakness, that rivals should be destroyed rather than defeated, that total war was more effective than negotiated settlement. This lesson would shape Roman foreign policy for centuries, would justify countless other destructions, would become part of Roman identity. The wars also bankrupted Roman society morally, normalized the kind of systematic violence and cultural erasure that Carthage experienced. Rome won the wars, but it lost something in the winning, some restraint, some humanity, some capacity for coexistence with rivals. 3 wars, 1 ending. Carthage destroyed, Rome triumphant but changed, the Mediterranean world reshaped forever. All the purple sails gone from the harbours, all the trade networks severed, all the libraries burned, all the voices silenced, and in the silence, Rome wrote the history, told the story, ensured that future generations would remember only their version, would celebrate the victory, would forget the cost. But the ruins remember, the walls remember, the harbours filled with rubble but still visible beneath Tunisian soil remember what was lost. For all that Rome tried to erase Carthage from memory, the impact of that vanished civilization shaped the Mediterranean world in ways that persisted long after the last Punic inscription faded from stone. Even in destruction, even as absence, Carthage left marks on the geography of power, on trade routes and city networks, on languages and technologies, and the very structure of how the ancient world understood commerce and naval empire. To understand the Mediterranean, you have to understand what Carthage contributed to it, what was lost when Rome salted the earth. Start with the most obvious impact, the network of cities that Carthage founded or fostered across the western Mediterranean. These weren't random settlements, they were strategic nodes in a commercial empire, placed where natural harbours met trade routes, where local resources could be accessed, where ships needed safe anchorage on long voyages. Carthage itself was the hub, but the spokes extended across 3 continents. In Spain, Carthago Nova and Gades. In Sicily, Motia and Panormus. In Sardinia, Caralis and Sulci. In North Africa, Hadrumetum and Leptis Minor. On Malta, Melita. Across the Balearic Islands, along the North African coast toward the Atlantic. Many of these cities survived Carthage's destruction, absorbed into Rome's empire but retaining their commercial character, their harbour facilities, their trading connections. They became Roman cities, but their foundations were Carthaginian. Their street grids reflected Phoenician planning. Their economies still depended on networks that Carthage had established. When you walk through the ruins of these places today, you're walking on layers, Roman columns standing on Carthaginian foundations, Islamic architecture incorporating stones from both previous civilizations, each layer testament to continuity beneath the changes of empire. The trading networks themselves proved more durable than the empire that created them. Carthage had spent centuries mapping the Mediterranean, learning wind patterns and current flows, finding the safest routes between ports, establishing relationships with coastal tribes and inland kingdoms. That knowledge didn't disappear when the city burned. Phoenician sailors and merchants scattered across the Mediterranean took it with them, some entering Roman service, others settling in Greek cities, all carrying maps and knowledge and connections that Rome inherited when it conquered Carthaginian territories. Rome built its commercial empire on Carthaginian foundations without acknowledging the debt. The trade routes Rome used to move grain from Africa to Italy, the harbours where Roman fleets anchored, the mines in Spain that filled Roman treasuries, all of these had been Carthaginian resources first, accessed through networks that Carthage had established. Rome didn't invent Mediterranean commerce, it conquered it and took credit for what Carthage had built over 6 centuries. The linguistic impact was more subtle but equally persistent. Punic, the Carthaginian language, survived for centuries after the city's destruction, particularly in North Africa, where it had mixed with local Berber languages to create unique dialects. Roman writers complained that North African provinces still spoke Punic generations after conquest, that rural areas resisted Latin, that even educated Africans spoke Latin with Punic accents and incorporated Punic words into their speech. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century AD, mentions that Punic was still spoken in North African villages 400 years after Carthage fell. Certain Punic words entered Latin and eventually Romance languages. Agricultural terms especially, words for specific crops and farming techniques that Carthaginians had mastered. The 28 volumes on agriculture that Rome translated from Punic became foundational texts for Roman farming, their techniques spreading across the empire. Every time a Roman farmer grafted an olive tree or rotated crops or managed water resources according to methods from those translated texts, they were using Carthaginian knowledge, practicing Carthaginian agriculture, even as they cursed Carthaginian memory. Technologically, Carthage's maritime innovations influenced Mediterranean shipbuilding for centuries. The quinquereme design, the covered dry docks, the use of prefabricated sections in ship construction, the techniques for extracting and applying copper sheathing to prevent hull fouling, all of these continued in use long after Carthage disappeared. Roman naval architecture borrowed heavily from Carthaginian models, often without acknowledgement. The circular harbour design that made the Carthaginian military ports so effective was copied by Roman engineers for imperial naval bases, a silent admission that Carthage had mastered naval infrastructure better than anyone else. Perhaps the most profound impact was political, though not in ways Carthage would have wanted. The Punic Wars shaped Roman identity, gave Rome an enemy against which to define itself, a rival whose defeat justified Roman expansion as necessary, defensive, civilizing. The wars created heroes. The Scipios who defeated Carthage became models of Roman virtue. They created legends, stories of Roman persistence and moral superiority that became foundational myths. They created vocabulary. Punic faith became a Roman phrase meaning treachery, a linguistic monument to Carthaginian defeat. But the wars also transformed Roman government, pushing power toward military leaders, normalizing extended commands and extraordinary powers that eventually undermined the Republic. The resources required to fight 3 Punic wars, the armies raised, the fleets built, the provinces administered, all of this expanded Roman government bureaucracy and created new centres of power that the old constitutional structures couldn't control. You can trace a line from Carthage's destruction to the Roman civil wars, to Caesar crossing the Rubicon, to the Republic becoming an empire. Defeating Carthage changed Rome more than Rome acknowledged. The impact on Carthage's former subjects was immediate and often brutal. Carthaginian territories in North Africa became Roman provinces, their resources extracted more efficiently, their peoples taxed more heavily, their autonomy eliminated. Whatever exploitation Carthage had practiced, and they certainly exploited their empire, Rome was worse. The Numidian kingdoms that had allied with Rome against Carthage eventually learned that Roman gratitude was temporary, Roman protection meant subordination, and Roman promises weren't worth the treaties they were written on. For the broader Mediterranean world, Carthage's destruction ended the possibility of a different model of empire, a maritime commercial network balanced against terrestrial conquest empires. What if Carthage had survived? What if Rome had been forced to coexist with a naval power controlling Western trade routes? The Mediterranean might have developed differently, more like later medieval Italy with competing city-states and commercial republics, rather than the unified imperial structure Rome imposed. We'll never know, because Rome eliminated that alternative, ensured that only the Roman model survived, only Roman methods were remembered. Even the gaps Carthage left shaped the Mediterranean. The sudden absence of Carthaginian ships from trade routes created opportunities for pirates, for rival merchants, for Greek and Egyptian traders who'd previously operated in Carthaginian shadow. The destruction of Carthaginian libraries eliminated whatever geographical knowledge they'd accumulated about Atlantic trade routes, African interior, possibly even routes to India that some scholars think Carthaginian explorers discovered. That knowledge vanished, wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries, a lost continent of human understanding. What remains is influence without acknowledgement, impact without credit, foundations supporting structures that deny their existence. Every Roman harbour built on Carthaginian models, every trade route following Carthaginian paths, every agricultural technique borrowed from Punic texts, every North African speaking a language with Punic vocabulary, every ship built using Carthaginian innovations, these were Carthage's inheritance to the Mediterranean world. Rome took the inheritance, burned the will, and pretended it had always belonged to them. But the Mediterranean remembers, in small ways, in buried harbours and scattered words and trading cities that predate Roman conquest. The purple sails are gone, but the wake they left still ripples through history. History tends to speak in abstractions, in empires and wars and the clash of civilizations, but every empire is built from individual lives, from ordinary people navigating extraordinary times, from families and friendships and daily decisions that collectively shape the fate of nations. To truly understand Carthage, we need to step back from the grand narrative of Punic wars and destruction, and try to imagine what life was actually like for the merchants loading ships in the circular harbour, for the sailors crossing unknown seas, for the families living in white-walled houses on narrow streets, watching their world change in ways they couldn't control. Imagine a Carthaginian merchant in the 3rd century BC, perhaps a man, named Hanno, a common Phoenician name. Let's say he's 40 years old, successful but not aristocratic, part of the commercial class that formed Carthage's foundation. He owns 3 ships, not a huge fleet but enough to run profitable trade routes between Carthage and the Iberian coast. His ships carry silver from Spanish mines to Carthage, then carry Carthaginian purple-dyed textiles and African ivory back to Spain, a circuit that takes 3 months in good weather, longer when storms close the shipping season. Hanno would rise before dawn, walk from his home near the residential quarter down to the commercial harbour, checking on his ships being loaded. He'd know every sailor by name, would inspect cargo personally, would calculate costs and profits in his head with the automatic precision that comes from doing this work for 20 years. His wealth is tied up in those ships, in the goods they carry, in the contracts he's negotiated with Spanish traders and African suppliers. One storm, one pirate attack, one diplomatic crisis could ruin him. But the rewards are worth the risk. In a good year he makes enough to expand his fleet, to renovate his house, to marry his daughter to a better family. He doesn't think much about Rome, not yet. There are growing power in Italy, certainly, and there are rumours about tensions in Sicily. But Carthage has weathered rivals before. The city has stood for 600 years, its purple banners have sailed these waters since before Rome existed, and Hanno trusts in the accumulated wisdom of Carthaginian commerce, the networks and alliances that have made his family prosperous for 3 generations. He offers sacrifices at the Temple of Tanit, praying for safe voyages, for good winds, for children who'll carry on the business when he's gone. Or imagine Eshmunazar, a sailor on one of those ships, 25 years old, born in a fishing village south of Carthage, who joined a merchant crew at 16 because it paid better than fishing. He's seen more of the world than most people ever will, has walked the streets of Gades on the Atlantic coast, has watched Iberian miners dig silver from mountains, has sailed past the Pillars of Hercules into waters where the stars are different, and the coast belongs to tribes who've never heard of Carthage or Greece or Rome. He's learned to read wind and wave, to navigate by stars, to sense when weather is changing before clouds appear. His life is hard, dangerous, paid in silver, but spent in cheap wine and brief harbour romances. He sleeps in cramped quarters below deck, eats salted fish and hard bread, works rope-roughened hands until they bleed during storms. But there's a freedom in it too, in being part of a crew, in the satisfaction of bringing a loaded ship safely home, in the stories he tells when he returns to his village, stories that make children's eyes widen and old men nod with respect. He has a girl in Carthage, a weaver's daughter he visits when his ship is in port, and he's been thinking maybe it's time to settle, to start a family, to find work on shore while he's still young enough to learn a new trade. Or imagine Sophoniba, a woman of aristocratic family, 28 years old, educated in both Punic and Greek, married to a suffet, one of the 2 chief magistrates who govern Carthage this year. Her days are spent managing a large household, 15 slaves and servants, 3 children, a husband whose political career requires constant entertaining of foreign ambassadors and local power brokers. She hosts dinners where Greek philosophers debate Carthaginian merchants, where Egyptian priests discuss theology with Phoenician traditionalists, where the business of empire gets conducted in quiet conversations over wine and roasted lamb. She's well read, keeps current with affairs, understands that the tension with Rome is more serious than her husband admits publicly. She worries about her sons, 12 and 9 years old, what kind of world they'll inherit, whether Carthage's long peace will hold, or whether their generation will see war. She makes offerings at the temple, not just routine prayers, but desperate pleading for the gods to protect her family, to preserve the civilization that's given her this life of comfort and culture. She wears purple, the expensive Tyrian dye that marks her status, and she's painfully aware that this colour, this luxury, depends on ships and trade and a maritime empire that might be more fragile than anyone wants to admit. These people, Hanno and Eshmanazar and Sophoniba, they didn't know they were living in the last peaceful generation of Carthage. When the First Punic War started in 264 BC, they probably thought it would be like previous conflicts, brief, limited, settled by diplomacy. When the war dragged on for 23 years, they adapted, adjusted, found ways to keep living, to keep trading, to keep raising children. When it finally ended with Carthaginian defeat in Sicily, they mourned the lost territory, resented the indemnity, but told themselves Carthage had survived worse. And then Hannibal crossed the Alps, and for 15 years their city was at war in ways they'd never imagined. Hanno's ships might have been requisitioned for military transport, his careful commercial calculations rendered irrelevant by wartime demands. Eshmanazar might have been conscripted into the navy, might have fought at sea against Roman fleets, might have died in some nameless battle far from home. Sophoniba might have seen her husband executed for political decisions that went wrong, might have watched her sons march off to war, might have ended her days in slavery after Carthage fell. Or perhaps they were luckier. Perhaps Hanno survived by adapting, by finding new routes and new markets, by navigating the dangerous waters of Carthage's decline with the same skill he'd used to navigate Mediterranean storms. Perhaps Eshmanazar settled down, married his weaver's daughter, raised children who never knew the glory days of Carthaginian power. Perhaps Sophoniba's family fled to Egypt or Syracuse when the Third Punic War began, carrying their portable wealth and their memories to foreign cities where they lived as exiles, telling stories of purple harbours and magnificent temples to children who would grow up speaking Greek rather than Punic. We don't know their individual fates because they weren't famous, weren't generals or senators, weren't important enough to be mentioned in the histories that survived. But they were the ones who made Carthage real, who lived in those white-walled houses archaeologists excavate, who walked those paved streets, who filled those magnificent harbours with life and commerce and the daily business of civilization. When we talk about Carthage being destroyed, we're talking about them, about families like theirs, about merchants and sailors and aristocrats whose lives were swept away by forces they couldn't control, the human element, the forgotten voices, the ordinary people living through extraordinary times. History erased their names, But archaeology gives us glimpses: a child's toy found in the ruins, a marriage contract inscribed on stone, a merchant's seal pressed into clay 2,000 years ago. These fragments whisper of lives lived, of hopes and fears, of people who thought their city would last forever and who were catastrophically wrong. They deserve to be remembered, not as abstractions, not as statistics, but as individuals who loved and feared and worked and dreamed under purple sails and Mediterranean sun in a city that existed, that mattered, that was real. If you want to understand resistance against impossible odds, if you want to see what one brilliant mind can accomplish against a superior enemy, if you want to witness the tragic beauty of a war fought with genius and lost through circumstances beyond any general's control, then study Hannibal's 15 years in Italy. This wasn't just military opposition to Rome, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, in doing more with less, in winning battles while losing the war, in proving that individual brilliance matters even when history is written by forces larger than any individual can control. Hannibal entered Italy in 218 BC with perhaps 26,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, all that remained of the 90,000 who'd left Spain before crossing the Alps. He faced a Roman military system that could field multiple armies of 40,000 men, that had virtually unlimited manpower from its Italian allies, that controlled all of Italy's resources and fortifications. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Hannibal won every battle, even if he destroyed every army Rome sent against him, Rome could simply raise new armies while Hannibal's forces could only shrink, ground down by attrition and distance from reinforcement. So Hannibal didn't fight the war Rome expected. He didn't march on Rome itself, didn't besiege cities, didn't try to conquer territory he couldn't hold. Instead, he fought a war of maneuver and alliance building, of destroying Roman armies in the field, of encouraging Rome's allies to defect, of demonstrating that Roman power was an illusion maintained by fear that could be shattered by sufficient military shock. His strategy was psychological as much as military, aimed at breaking Roman morale and the Italian confederation that gave Rome its strength. The first test came at the Trebia River in December of 218 BC, barely 2 months after he'd entered Italy. The Roman consul Sempronius led 40,000 men against Hannibal's army, confident that Roman heavy infantry would crush these travel-weary foreigners. Hannibal lured them across an icy river at dawn, positioned his forces to envelop them from the flanks, while his brother Mago led a hidden force that attacked from behind. The Romans broke, 10,000 died, the rest scattered. Hannibal had announced his arrival in terms Rome couldn't ignore. The next year brought an even more spectacular victory at Lake Trasimene. Hannibal marched his army through marshes that Romans thought impassable, drawing the consul Flaminius and his army of 30,000 into pursuing him. Then he ambushed them along the shore of the lake, trapping the Roman column between water and steep hills, enveloping them in morning fog that turned battle into massacre. 15,000 Romans died, including Flaminius himself, another 15,000 captured. It was the largest ambush in military history to that point, a textbook example of terrain and timing used to overcome numerical disadvantage. Rome panicked, appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus, who understood that Hannibal couldn't be beaten in open battle, and adopted a strategy of avoiding engagement, shadowing the Carthaginian army, harassing supply lines, waiting for time and attrition to erode Carthaginian strength. It was sensible, cautious, strategically sound. It was also politically unpopular. Romans wanted glorious victory, not prudent delay. When Fabius's term ended, Rome elected new consuls who promised to destroy Hannibal decisively. The result was Cannae, fought in August of 216 BC, Hannibal's masterpiece and one of the most studied battles in military history. Rome assembled its largest army ever, 86,000 men under both consuls, and marched to crush Hannibal's force of 50,000. Hannibal deployed his troops in a crescent formation, weak in the centre, strong on the flanks with his cavalry. The Romans attacked the centre, pushing it back, convinced they were breaking through. But the crescent bent without breaking, and as Romans pressed forward, Hannibal's flanks enveloped them, his cavalry circled behind, and the entire Roman army was surrounded. What followed was slaughter. Packed too tight to fight effectively, Roman soldiers were cut down from all sides for hours. By day's end, 50,000 Romans lay dead, including one consul, both proconsuls, 29 military tribunes, and 80 senators who'd volunteered to fight. Another 10,000 were captured. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history, a defeat so total that cities across Italy began defecting to Hannibal, convinced that Rome was finished. But Rome wasn't finished. They refused to negotiate, forbade even discussing peace, and adopted Fabian tactics of avoiding battle while slowly strangling Hannibal's position. They sent armies to Spain to cut off his reinforcements. They besieged cities that defected to him. They fortified positions and waited, and Hannibal, trapped in southern Italy with a shrinking army, couldn't force them to fight and couldn't win the war through defensive operations. For 13 years after Cannae, from 216 to 203 BC, Hannibal remained in Italy, undefeated in battle but unable to achieve strategic victory. His brother Hasdrubal attempted to bring reinforcements from Spain, crossed the Alps with a new army, but was intercepted and killed before he could reach Hannibal. The message Hasdrubal's head thrown into Hannibal's camp told him everything he needed to know. He was alone, reinforcements wouldn't come, and Rome would outlast him through sheer stubborn endurance. The war moved to other theatres. In Spain, Roman armies conquered Carthaginian territories, cutting off the silver mines that funded the war effort. In Sicily, Rome besieged Syracuse, the Greek city that had allied with Carthage. And eventually, inevitably, a Roman army under Scipio invaded North Africa, threatening Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy, leaving the peninsula where he'd spent 15 years, where he'd won every battle and lost the war. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio defeated him using tactics Hannibal had pioneered: flexible formations, cavalry superiority, envelopment. It was bitter poetry, the student surpassing the teacher, the Roman learning from the Carthaginian and then using that knowledge to destroy him. Hannibal survived the battle, but the war was over. Carthage sued for peace on humiliating terms. Hannibal spent his remaining years trying to rebuild Carthage economically, serving as suffect, reforming government, generating revenue to pay the Roman indemnity. But Rome pressured Carthage to prosecute him as a war criminal, to punish the man who terrorized Italy. Rather than face Roman vengeance, Hannibal fled east, offering his services to various kings fighting Rome, advising, consulting, never surrendering. He spent 20 years in exile, always moving, always one step ahead of the Roman agents, a ghost haunting the edges of the Mediterranean, a reminder of what might have been. He died in 183 BC, probably by poison, probably suicide to avoid capture, in a small village in Bithynia, far from Carthage, far from the Alps, far from everything he'd fought for. His last words, according to legend, were about Rome's anxiety. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, for they think it too long to wait for an old man's death. Even in death, he understood that Rome feared him, that his very existence was opposition, that as long as he lived he represented the possibility of Carthaginian resurgence. He was the greatest general of his age, possibly of any age, a military genius who understood that war is fought in the mind as much as on the battlefield. He opposed Rome for 36 years, from crossing the Alps at age 29 to his death in exile at 65, and he never surrendered, never accepted defeat, never stopped being dangerous. Rome destroyed his city, scattered his people, and tried to erase his memory. But they couldn't erase his campaigns, couldn't undo his victories, couldn't deny that for 15 years one Carthaginian kept Rome terrified. The opposition failed, Carthage still fell. But Hannibal proved that opposition matters, that resistance leaves marks even in defeat, that individual brilliance can challenge imperial power and force history to remember. There's something particularly tragic about being the last generation of something beautiful, the final people to walk streets that will soon be rubble, to speak a language that's about to die, to practice traditions that won't survive the coming storm. The Carthaginians living in the mid-2nd century BC, between the Second and Third Punic Wars, were that last generation. They'd survived catastrophic defeat, had rebuilt their city and their economy, had lived to see Carthage prosperous again, and they desperately, tragically believed they might survive, that Rome would allow them to coexist as a subordinate but independent city, that the worst was behind them. They were experiencing a kind of awakening, a cultural and economic renaissance that makes their eventual destruction even more heartbreaking. After the Second Punic War ended in 201 BC with Carthaginian defeat, the peace terms had been harsh: loss of territory, massive indemnity, prohibition on making war without Roman permission. But Carthage had been left intact, allowed to keep its government, its commerce, its identity. And in the 50 years that followed, Carthaginian merchants did what they did best: they traded. The city rebuilt faster than anyone expected. The harbours, damaged during the war, were repaired and expanded. The walls, where Roman siege engines had battered them, were reinforced. The commercial district bustled with renewed energy, ships from Egypt and Greece and Spain filling the docks with goods that Carthaginian merchants distributed across North Africa. The purple dye works resumed operation. The fishing fleet brought in catches that fed the growing population, and farmers in the African territories supplied grain that Carthage exported for profit. Within a generation, the city was wealthy again, not as powerful militarily, but commercially vibrant, culturally alive. This period saw a flowering of what we might call Carthaginian cultural consciousness, an awareness that they needed to preserve and celebrate their heritage, to affirm their identity as something distinct from and valuable beyond their relationship with Rome. The aristocratic families commissioned new temples, not just to maintain religious tradition, but to assert that Carthaginian gods and Carthaginian worship still mattered. Schools taught Punic alongside Greek and Latin, ensuring the next generation could read the inscriptions of their ancestors. Merchants commissioned works of art, sculptures and mosaics and metalwork that blended Phoenician, Egyptian and Greek styles into something uniquely Carthaginian. Intellectually, this was Carthage's most self-aware period. For 600 years, Carthaginians had been practical, focused on trade and governance, leaving philosophy and literature to the Greeks. But now, facing an uncertain future, some began writing histories and philosophical treatises, trying to record Carthaginian perspectives on the Punic Wars, on Mediterranean politics, on their own cultural traditions. Almost all of this literature was lost when Rome destroyed the city, but we know it existed because Greek and Roman authors mention it, sometimes dismissively, occasionally with grudging respect. The political awakening was more controversial and ultimately fatal. Hannibal, returned from exile briefly after Zama, had served as suffete and implemented reforms aimed at rooting out corruption and improving government efficiency. He'd challenged the entrenched aristocracy, redistributed power, and made Carthage more democratic, more responsive to merchant classes and popular will. His reforms didn't survive his flight into exile when Rome pressured Carthage to prosecute him, but they planted ideas, suggested that Carthage could govern itself effectively, could rebuild not just commercially but politically. A new generation of Carthaginian leaders emerged, men who'd been children during the Second Punic War, who remembered the terror of Roman invasion, but who'd spent their adult lives in peace, who believed that cooperation with Rome could work if Carthage was careful, if they followed the rules, if they demonstrated loyalty. They paid the Roman indemnity on schedule, maintained cordial relations with Roman ambassadors, stayed scrupulously neutral in Rome's other conflicts. They thought appeasement would ensure survival. But there was another faction, smaller and more desperate, who understood that Rome would never allow Carthage to flourish, that Roman security required Carthaginian extinction, that no amount of cooperation would save them. These voices were dismissed as paranoid, as bitter remnants of the war party, as people living in the past. When Numidian kings, Rome's allies, began raiding Carthaginian territory, provoking conflicts that tested whether Carthage would defend itself in violation of the peace treaty, the moderates urged restraint, urged appealing to Rome for arbitration, urged patience. The awakening of this last generation was incomplete because they couldn't quite believe what was coming, couldn't accept that their revival was temporary, that Rome was simply waiting for a pretext to finish what they'd started 50 years earlier. They saw evidence. Cato the Elder ending every Senate speech with Carthage must be destroyed, Roman support for Numidian aggression, Roman ambassadors cataloguing supposed treaty violations, but they rationalized it, convinced themselves that good behavior would be rewarded, that their economic success proved they weren't a threat. In 150 BC, provoked beyond endurance by Numidian raids, Carthage finally raised an army to defend its territory without seeking Roman permission. They defeated the Numidians, a small defensive victory that was completely legal under any reasonable interpretation of sovereign rights. Rome declared it a treaty violation and demanded punishment. Carthage, trying desperately to placate Rome, executed their own generals who'd led the defensive campaign, punished the war party, sent ambassadors to Rome pleading for understanding. Rome demanded more. Send hostages, 300 sons of aristocratic families. Carthage complied. Surrender your weapons, every sword and spear and catapult. Carthage complied, delivering 200,000 sets of armour, and then came the final demand, the one that revealed Rome's true intention. Abandon your city and relocate inland, away from the harbours, away from the sea that was the foundation of Carthaginian identity and prosperity. That's when the awakening became complete, when even the most conciliatory faction realised there would be no survival through cooperation, that Rome wanted extinction, not subordination, that they'd been foolish to hope. The city that had been rebuilding for 50 years, that had been celebrating its revival, that had been preserving its culture and reforming its government, suddenly understood it was living on borrowed time, that all the reconstruction and renaissance and renewal had been the last flourishing before the fall. The last generation made one final choice. Rather than abandon their city and fade away peacefully, they chose resistance. They freed slaves and armed them. They turned workshops into weapons manufactories. They melted down statues and temple decorations to make swords. They tore apart buildings for stone to rebuild walls. Women cut their hair to make bowstrings. Civilians worked day and night building defences. The city transformed from commercial centre to fortress in desperate, futile preparation. They held out for 3 years, from 149 to 146 BC, fighting with the fury of people who know they're already dead but refuse to die quietly. When Roman soldiers finally breached the walls and fought into the city, Carthaginians retreated house by house, street by street, until the last survivors barricaded themselves in the Temple of Eshmun and chose fire over slavery. The awakening came too late. The cultural renaissance ended in ash. The last generation died defending a city they'd believed they could save, a civilization they'd thought they could preserve, a heritage they'd awakened to value just in time to watch it burn. The deepest truth about Carthage's destruction isn't found in military history or economic rivalry, or the specific provocations that triggered the Third Punic War. It lies in something more fundamental about empire and power, about what happens when one civilization cannot tolerate the existence of another, cannot accept that different models of Mediterranean dominance might coexist, cannot rest while an alternative to their own system continues to breathe. Rome didn't just destroy Carthage because it was a military threat. By 146 BC it wasn't. Rome destroyed Carthage because its very existence was an ideological challenge that had to be eliminated completely. Consider the timing and the circumstances. When Rome demanded that Carthage abandon its city and relocate inland in 149 BC, Carthage posed no military danger whatsoever. The peace treaty from 201 BC had stripped away Carthaginian territory, fleet and army. For nearly 50 years, Carthage had paid its indemnity faithfully, had avoided conflict, had become a commercial city focused on trade rather than power. The Numidian provocations that led to Carthage's desperate self-defense were orchestrated with Roman approval, designed to create a pretext for war that Rome had already decided to wage. So why? If Carthage wasn't a military threat, if it had been neutered as a rival power, if it posed no danger to Roman expansion, why go to such extraordinary lengths to destroy it completely? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about imperial psychology, about the insecurity that underlies even the most powerful states, about the need to eliminate not just enemies, but alternatives. Carthage represented a different way of being powerful. Where Rome built its strength on military conquest and territorial expansion, on citizen soldiers fighting for glory and land, on a political system that rewarded martial virtue above all else, Carthage had built its power through commerce and naval dominance, through professional armies and trade networks, through a government that balanced aristocratic and democratic elements in ways Rome's Senate-dominated system didn't. These weren't just different strategies, they were fundamentally different visions of what Mediterranean civilization could be. As long as Carthage existed, even as a defeated city, even as a subordinate ally, it offered proof that Rome's way wasn't the only way. It suggested that empire could be built through trade rather than conquest, that naval power could rival land power, that commercial prosperity might matter more than military glory. This was intolerable to Roman ideology, to the foundation myths that Rome told itself about why it deserved to rule, about what made Roman civilization superior to all others. The Roman senator Cato the Elder understood this instinctively. His famous insistence that Carthage must be destroyed, repeated at the end of every speech regardless of topic, wasn't based on military analysis or strategic necessity. It was ideological conviction, the belief that Rome could never be secure while an alternative model of Mediterranean power continued to exist, even in diminished form. Cato once brought fresh figs to the Senate, claimed they'd been picked in Carthage 3 days earlier, and used this to argue that a city so close to Rome, so potentially prosperous, was an eternal danger. The argument was absurd as military strategy but powerful as propaganda. What Cato articulated, and what the Roman Senate eventually accepted, was that Carthage's destruction needed to be total, not just military defeat but cultural obliteration, not just conquest but erasure. This explains the extraordinary thoroughness of what Rome did in 146 BC. They didn't just defeat Carthage, they burned it for 17 days, pulled down its walls stone by stone, filled in its harbours with rubble, sold 50,000 survivors into slavery, and ploughed the ruins. Whether they actually scattered salt, as legend claims, is debated by historians, but the symbolic truth is clear. They wanted nothing to grow there again, wanted the very ground cursed, wanted future generations to see only wasteland where Carthage had stood. Then came the cultural erasure, equally systematic. Carthaginian libraries were destroyed, every text burned except those agricultural treatises Rome found useful. The Punic language was gradually suppressed, replaced by Latin in all official contexts, allowed to survive only in rural areas where Roman authority was weakest. Carthaginian religion was banned, temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit demolished, priests scattered or killed, sacred sites desecrated. Within a generation, the institutional foundations of Carthaginian culture had been eliminated. But the most insidious erasure was historical. Rome didn't just destroy Carthaginian sources, they monopolized the narrative, ensured that all future accounts of Carthage would be written from Roman perspectives, filtered through Roman biases, serving Roman purposes. They portrayed Carthage as barbarous, treacherous, morally inferior, a civilization that deserved destruction. They emphasized child sacrifice, whether real or exaggerated, to justify genocide. They portrayed Carthaginian commerce as greed, their professional armies as cowardice, their naval power as illegitimate compared to Roman territorial conquest. This historical erasure was so effective that for 2,000 years, educated people across Europe and the Mediterranean accepted Roman characterizations as objective truth, taught Carthage as the villain in Rome's heroic story, used Punic faith as a synonym for treachery. The alternative model Carthage represented was forgotten so completely that it became difficult to even imagine Mediterranean civilization developing differently, difficult to conceive that Rome's way wasn't inevitable or natural or superior. The revelation, what archaeology and critical history have slowly uncovered, is that Rome's insecurity was justified. Carthage was a viable alternative, was in many ways more sophisticated than Rome, had achieved technological and commercial successes that Rome only matched generations later. The circular harbours were more advanced than anything Rome built until the imperial period. The agricultural techniques preserved in those translated Punic texts became foundational to Roman farming. The maritime knowledge Carthaginian sailors had accumulated over 6 centuries gave Rome the expertise to dominate Mediterranean trade. In destroying Carthage, Rome eliminated a superior rival, and then spent centuries incorporating Carthaginian innovations while denying their origin. The salting of the earth, whether literal or metaphorical, was about eliminating possibility, about ensuring that no one could look at Carthage and think there might be another way, a better way, a way that didn't require military conquest and territorial expansion and the endless cycle of war that eventually exhausted even Rome. It was about insecurity masked as strength, about fear disguised as necessity, about the recognition that allowing alternatives to survive is dangerous when your own system depends on claiming to be the only legitimate model. Every empire since has understood this lesson, has recognized that defeating enemies isn't enough if those enemies represent alternative visions of power and civilization. You have to erase them, control their story, ensure that future generations know them only as villains who deserved their fate, never as rivals who might have been right, who might have offered something better, who might have built a world worth preserving. Rome salted the earth because Carthage's existence, even in memory, was a threat to everything Rome claimed about itself. The revelation is that this threat was real, that Carthage did offer an alternative, and that Rome's 1,000-year dominance of the Mediterranean might have been different, might have been shared, might have included rather than excluded other ways of being powerful. But we'll never know, because Rome made sure we couldn't, made sure the alternative died so completely that we can barely imagine it existed at all. Step back now from the specific tragedy of Carthage and consider what it reveals about a pattern that repeats throughout history. The tendency of empires not just to defeat their rivals but to erase them from memory, to control their stories, to ensure that future generations know the conquered only through the conqueror's lens. This isn't unique to Rome and Carthage. It's a fundamental feature of how power operates, how dominance perpetuates itself, how the winners write history in ways that justify what they've done and prevent alternatives from being remembered or imagined. Think about how many civilizations we know only through the accounts of those who destroyed them. The Aztecs, known primarily through Spanish chronicles that portrayed them as bloodthirsty savages practicing human sacrifice on an industrial scale, justifying conquest and conversion. We have some Aztec texts, some codices that survived the burning of their libraries, but the dominant narrative remained Spanish, and it took centuries of archaeological and anthropological work to begin recovering Aztec perspectives, to understand that Spanish accounts were as much propaganda as description. Or consider the indigenous peoples of North America, whose histories were written almost entirely by European colonizers and American settlers who had every reason to portray them as primitive, as obstacles to progress, as peoples without complex civilizations or legitimate claims to land. The mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley, the sophisticated agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands, the complex political confederations like the Iroquois League, all of this was minimized or ignored in favor of narratives that made conquest seem inevitable and necessary. Only recently have historians begun recovering indigenous perspectives, listening to oral traditions, reading the archaeological record without colonial assumptions. The pattern is consistent across time and geography. Empires destroy their rivals, then destroy the rivals' ability to speak for themselves, then create narratives that justify the destruction retrospectively. The conquered become barbarians, savages, threats to civilization, peoples whose elimination was unfortunate perhaps but necessary, certainly deserved. And because the empire controls education, controls what gets written and preserved and taught, these narratives become accepted truth, internalized even by descendants of the conquered, normalized across generations. Carthage is perhaps the clearest example, because the erasure was so complete, and because we can trace exactly how it happened. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage militarily, they destroyed every Carthaginian source, monopolized the narrative for 2 millennia, and created a version of Carthaginian history that served Roman purposes. The child sacrifice accusations, whether true or exaggerated, became the defining characteristic of Carthaginian civilization in Western memory. The commercial achievements, the technological innovations, the sophisticated government, the 600-year history of successful Mediterranean empire, all of this disappeared behind the image of barbarous, child killers who deserved their fate, and it worked, spectacularly, for 2,000 years. From the Roman period through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment, through the 19th century, educated people across Europe accepted Roman characterizations of Carthage without question. When Virgil wrote the Aeneid and portrayed Dido as a tragic queen whose suicide was caused by Roman destiny, readers understood that Rome's triumph over Carthage was inevitable, fated, part of a divine plan. When Christian theologians like Augustine used Carthage as an example of pagan wickedness, they were building on Roman foundations, accepting Roman narratives, perpetuating Roman erasure. Only in the 20th century, only after extensive archaeological excavation and critical examination of sources, did scholars begin questioning the Roman version, begin recovering glimpses of what Carthage actually was. And even now, even with all that work, the popular imagination still defaults to Roman perspectives. Mention Carthage and people think of Hannibal the enemy, not of the Purple City with its magnificent harbours. The erasure remains partially successful even after we've identified it and tried to correct it. This should make us deeply suspicious of any historical narrative that comes entirely from victors, that portrays the conquered as uniformly barbarous or primitive or threatening. It should make us ask what perspectives we're missing, what voices were silenced, what alternatives were eliminated along with the peoples who embodied them. When we learn about history's losers only through their enemies' accounts, we should assume we're getting propaganda, not objectivity, justification, rather than truth. The reflection becomes particularly important in our own time, when we're still living with the consequences of imperial erasures, still trying to recover perspectives that were suppressed, still unlearning narratives that justified conquest and colonization. The techniques Rome used on Carthage, destroying sources, controlling education, creating justifying narratives, these same techniques were used by European empires in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. They were used by colonial powers to justify the exploitation of indigenous peoples. They're still being used in more subtle forms by dominant powers trying to control how their actions are understood and remembered. Understanding Carthage's erasure helps us recognize the pattern elsewhere, helps us become critical readers of any history that portrays the defeated as villains and the victors as heroes, that reduces complex civilizations to simple stereotypes, that assumes might makes right and winners are winners because they deserve to be. It reminds us that absence of evidence might mean destruction rather than non-existence, that silence in the historical record might indicate murder rather than insignificance, that what we don't know about the past might be the most important part. There's a deeper philosophical question here too, about whether history can ever be objective when it's written by people with power and interests, whether the past can ever be known truly, or whether it's always filtered through the biases and agendas of those who control the narrative. Carthage suggests that objectivity is difficult, maybe impossible, but that we can at least become aware of bias, can at least question dominant narratives, can at least try to hear the silenced voices even when they speak only through gaps and absences in archaeological fragments. The ruins of Carthage are a memorial not just to one destroyed civilization, but to all the civilizations that empires have erased, all the alternatives that were eliminated, all the voices that were silenced. They remind us that history is written by the powerful, that the defeated rarely get to tell their stories, that what we think we know about the past might be carefully constructed propaganda rather than truth. They challenge us to read critically, to question authority, to imagine that there might have been other ways, better ways, ways that were destroyed because they threatened the dominant narrative. Every empire creates ruins, every conqueror writes history, every victor claims their triumph was inevitable, necessary, deserved. Carthage teaches us to doubt those claims, to look for what's missing, to remember that behind every imperial narrative of civilization versus barbarism is usually a more complicated truth, a truth where the defeated might have been as civilized as their conquerors, might have offered alternatives worth preserving, might have been destroyed not because they were inferior but because they were different. The reflection demands humility, demands recognizing that we might be wrong about much of what we think we know, demands keeping space for voices we can't quite hear, for stories we can't quite recover, for civilizations that existed and mattered and were real, even though empires tried to erase them from memory. That's what Carthage gives us. Not just the specific history of one Mediterranean city, but a lens for understanding how empires operate, how power perpetuates itself through controlling memory, and how important it is to resist that control, to question dominant narratives, to remember what empires want us to forget. The sun sets over the Tunisian coast, much as it did 3,000 years ago, turning the Mediterranean to gold and purple, the same colours that once marked Carthaginian sails crossing these waters in fleets that commanded the Western Sea. The modern city of Tunis sprawls where ancient Carthage stood, suburbs and hotels built over ruins, tourists walking paths that Phoenician merchants once travelled, children playing on ground that was fought over, burned, ploughed, and eventually rebuilt by the very empire that destroyed it. The continuity is broken, but not completely. The land remembers even when human memory fails, the harbours are still visible as depressions in the earth, the walls still traceable as foundations beneath Roman columns and Islamic architecture and French colonial buildings. Stand here at sunset and you can almost imagine it. The white-walled city rising in tiers from the circular harbours, the purple banners catching the wind, the merchant ships arriving from Spain and Sicily and the mysterious lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. You can almost hear the marketplace babel of languages, Punic and Greek and Egyptian and Iberian, the sound of commerce that connected 3 continents. You can almost smell the purple dye works, the fishing fleets unloading catches, the bread baking in thousands of ovens to feed 400,000 people living in one of the ancient world's great cities. But it's only almost, only imagination, only the ghosts that archaeology and historical reconstruction can summon. The real Carthage, the living city with its actual voices and daily rhythms and particular quality of light on limestone walls, that's gone forever. The libraries burned, the language died. The people were scattered as slaves or fled as refugees or died defending streets that exist now only as archaeological trenches and tourist information boards. What remains is fragments, pieces, enough to know something magnificent was lost but not enough to fully recover it. This is the nature of deep historical loss, not the clean disappearance of natural disaster, but the messy, violent erasure of human conflict, where one civilization deliberately destroys another and then spends centuries justifying the destruction. Carthage isn't gone because of earthquake or plague or gradual decline, it's gone because Rome wanted it gone, worked systematically to obliterate it, and succeeded so well that for 2,000 years Carthage existed only as a villain in someone else's story. Yet memory persists in unexpected ways. In the Punic words that survived in Latin and eventually in Romance languages, agricultural terms and maritime vocabulary that Carthaginian sailors and farmers embedded so deeply in Mediterranean culture that they outlasted the empire that created them. In the harbour designs that Roman engineers copied for their own naval bases, silently acknowledging Carthaginian superiority in maritime engineering, in the street grids of North African cities that still follow patterns laid down by Phoenician colonists, in the DNA of modern Tunisians, many of whom carry genetic markers from Phoenician ancestors who arrived here 3,000 years ago. The purple memory, faded but ineradicable, stains the fabric of Mediterranean history in ways that can't be completely removed. Even Rome, for all its efforts at erasure, couldn't eliminate Carthaginian influence, couldn't undo the 6 centuries of Carthaginian innovation and commerce and cultural achievement. They inherited a world that Carthage had shaped, used trade routes Carthage had mapped, incorporated technologies Carthage had developed, governed territories Carthage had first organized. The ghost of Carthage haunted Roman North Africa throughout the imperial period, visible in the persistent use of Punic language, in religious practices that blended Roman and Carthaginian elements, in commercial networks that predated and outlasted Roman political control. Modern archaeology continues the work of recovery, continues excavating what Rome buried, continues questioning what Roman sources claimed. Every season brings new discoveries, new foundation walls, new inscriptions, new artifacts that add detail to our understanding of what was lost. The circular harbours have been extensively mapped, their sophisticated engineering documented and analysed. The residential quarters have yielded homes with mosaics and plumbing that demonstrate urban sophistication. The Topet has been studied with modern forensic techniques that challenge Roman accusations while acknowledging the genuine strangeness of Carthaginian religious practices to modern eyes. But recovery is always incomplete, always partial, always filtered through our own biases and limitations. We can excavate buildings but not conversations, can read inscriptions but not poetry, can map streets but not the lives lived on them. The human element, the daily texture of Carthaginian life, the jokes and songs and small kindnesses, the love affairs and family quarrels and moments of beauty that make any civilization real, that's mostly lost. What archaeology recovers is impressive, but it's the skeleton, not the living body, the structure without the animating spirit. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps complete recovery isn't possible. Perhaps it's enough to acknowledge that something significant was lost, that a civilization existed and mattered and was deliberately destroyed, that the erasure was a tragedy regardless of whether we can fully reconstruct what was erased. Perhaps the purple memory, faded and fragmentary, is more honest than any complete reconstruction could be, more truthful in its admission of gaps and absences and uncertainties. The legacy of Carthage isn't just historical, it's moral and political, and deeply relevant to how we understand power and memory, and the responsibility we have to question dominant narratives. Every time we read a victor's history skeptically, every time we ask what perspectives are missing from the record, Every time we resist the simplification of complex civilizations into villains and heroes, we're carrying forward something Carthage teaches us. That empires lie, that absence of evidence might mean destruction, that the silences in history are often the most important parts. The purple sails are gone from Mediterranean waters. The Phoenician language survives only in inscriptions and scattered words. The great circular harbours are filled with rubble and sand. The temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit are foundations beneath tourist sites. The libraries are ash. The people are scattered across 2,000 years of history, untraceable, unnamed, forgotten. But the fact of Carthage remains, the undeniable reality that it existed, that it built an empire through commerce rather than conquest, that it challenged Rome and nearly won, that it represented an alternative that was destroyed because alternatives are dangerous to empires that claim inevitability. That fact, preserved in ruins and archaeological reports and critical histories, is a kind of victory over erasure, incomplete but real, a purple stain that time and empire couldn't completely remove. The sun sets over Tunis, over the peninsula where Carthage stood. The Mediterranean turns gold and purple, the colours that once marked Phoenician mastery of these waters. Tourists photograph the ruins, children play in the archaeological park. The modern world goes on, mostly unaware of what was lost here, mostly content with the simplified story of Rome's triumph over a barbarous enemy. But some people stand in the ruins and feel the weight of absence, recognise the tragedy of a civilization erased, understand that what we don't know about Carthage might be more important than what we do know. They listen to the silence where Punic voices should be, they imagine the libraries that burned, they mourn the alternative that was eliminated, and in that mourning, in that recognition of loss, in that refusal to accept the victor's narrative uncritically, Carthage lives again, however partially, however incompletely. The purple memory persists, faded but ineradicable, a reminder that history is written by the powerful but doesn't belong to them, that the defeated deserve to be remembered, that empires rise and fall but the human cost of their conflicts echoes through centuries. Close your eyes one final time. Breathe deeply. Let yourself drift across the Mediterranean sunset, back to a harbour that no longer exists, to purple sails that disappeared 2,000 years ago, to a city that believed it would last forever and was catastrophically wrong. Remember Carthage, not as Rome wanted it remembered, but as it was, magnificent and flawed and real and worthy of more than the footnote history assigned it. The purple memory endures, and that, however small a victory, however incomplete a resurrection, matters,